Gentlemen, we're going to call this meeting back to order with the singing of our national anthem. Orangeville Town Council welcomes and encourages members of the public to comment on matters of interest to them. However, delegates are cautioned that derogatory or inappropriate remarks may constitute slander and could potentially lead to legal action against them. If such comments are made, the delegate will not be permitted to continue speaking, and the comments will not be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Our first item of business tonight is to rise and report out of our closed meeting. We're going to report that the town council has determined to appoint the following to the transit task force. I'll read their names: Ryan Booth, Robert Long, Patrick Neely, Martina Rowley, Ian Wilson, Martin Woodhouse, and Brian Wormington. Also, we need a motion from one of our councilors here to appoint Councillor Taylor and Deputy Mayor McIntosh as council members of this committee, and that the terms of reference be amended to increase the membership up to 8 to up to 9, and that 6 members of the public be increased to 7 members of the public. May I have that motion? Councillor Sherwood, seconded by Councillor Post. All in favor? Okay, that item is passed. May I have a motion to adopt the minutes of the previous council meeting? Deputy Mayor McIntosh, seconded by Councillor Peters. Any comments on previous minutes? All in favor? Thank you. Also just wanted to make a comment. Our good friend Mr. Andrews is under the weather and is not with us tonight, so we wish Joe all the best. Presentations tonight. The first delegation is Elisa Gardner, wants to speak to concerns about green space behind houses on Hutchison Court. Ms. Gardner.
Good evening. My family and I have lived on Hutchison Court for over 6 years. We are proud to live in Orangeville and want to raise our family here. Today, I speak not just for my family, but for our entire neighborhood. We are concerned that the town does not look after our isolated subdivision. Specifically, there is a declining effort in maintaining the green space behind the residential homes on Hutchison Court. Originally, the tall grass was cut and maintained on a regular basis. I have been told that this is a naturalized green space, but I do not understand what that means. The area has now become overgrown as noxious weeds range from 3 to 5 feet tall in all areas. As you can see, I am standing beside some of the weeds, and you could see I'm 5'2". These weeds are 5'2" and taller. Given the overgrown weeds, we are very concerned about ticks. The current state of the green space area is a natural breeding spot for ticks. We are concerned for the safety of our children, pets, and ourselves. There is an increase in ticks in the Wellington, and Dufferin County. The health department has advised that all persons should be vigilant when in open areas, as ticks can cause Lyme disease and other health issues. Ticks live in unkept areas that have tall grasses, such as the green space behind Hutchison Court. We have noticed a significant increase in mosquitoes. Some of the increase is due to the wet spring that is part of the path, yet the unkept green space is a large part of the problem. The tall weeds have enabled many insects and rodents to make that area their home. Often these insects and rodents make their way into the backyards of those who live on Hutchison Court. We now have incurred the extra expense of using a lawn care company to treat our grass in an effort to reduce the weeds and grubs that blow into our backyards. The green space is also a high traffic area. The path is directly across from a local park. Many children play on this path, and several residents use this path daily for walks, runs, etc. Now, you may ask why we don't cut this area ourselves. Well, first of all, it's not our property. Next, it could become an insurance and liability issue. We also do not have the proper equipment, as we have residential lawnmowers, unlike the industrial ones that the town has. Now, the town does cut a portion of the property on a regular basis. Since the equipment and labor is already there, we do not understand why the town does not simply cut the entire property. We believe that our tax dollars paid should cover this service. Effort and cost to the taxpayers would be minimal. Here is a petition that we have signed from the residents on the court and neighborhood that also would like this pathway to be maintained properly. So if you look at the photo, this is directly from the park. This area is cut beautifully. If you look closely, you'll start to see the path. These are another photo of how tall these weeds are. This is right off of Pheasant Court, directly across from the path. This area is beautifully maintained, and again, cannot understand why other areas off of our path are not maintained to the same standard. This is what the path looks like. Again, this is the area that we don't understand why it's not maintained. In closing, we Orangeville residents are held to a certain standard under the bylaws to maintain our property and keep our grass under 15 to 20 centimeters and to not have noxious weeds, rodents, or overgrown bushes and dangerous insects within our property. The town is held to the same standard, and not only do I feel, but many of the members of the community feel that the town is not abiding by these laws or standards. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gardner. Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
Yes, Your Worship. Through you to Mr. Osmond, do you get a comment on some of these issues?
Through you, Your Worship, to Deputy Mayor McIntosh. The question is a good one because when you get into naturalization, there's always, well, what do we naturalize and what do we mow? First of all, our policy on mowing grass on our trail system right now is 1 meter on each side, unless we're in the entrance area. And it is typical in the entrance area to mow so far in from the street. The concerns of the neighborhood with respect to naturalization started with the development agreement. In fact, the development agreement that was signed back in 2017 for this particular neighborhood stipulates that we cannot mow grass within certain distance of the walkway and the fence because it is naturalized. If we were to go in and cut it, we'd probably be in a breach of contract. If we change our policy with respect to that, it will take a council motion to do that. The previous council made a decision and signed an agreement that would protect the area for naturalization. There's a lot of other areas in around this community that are naturalized. The big question for us as we get into this particular issue is how far do we go, because it's one particular area. Once we decide to not naturalize or naturalize, we have to determine how many areas do we have and how many staff do we need to increase our capacity to mow and get into some of these areas. It is, when you look at these areas that you're talking about in terms of going in and doing the labor on it and mowing it, a simple lawnmower can't do it. Some of these areas will require one piece of equipment. It could be a whippersnipper, as an example, that would cut in certain areas, because we have a whole combination of trees, shrubbery, plants, pollinators to attract bees and so on and so forth. So it is while it might look kind of rough and as a vegetated area, it's planned that way, it's planted that way, and it grows that way. And we have another bigger concern. We look at this particular issue is that right now we have 20 plus, a little over 20 kilometers of trail in this community that we maintain. And generally we cut as per 1 meter. As we look at our trail master plan, we're going to increase the number of trails. We'll also have to consider, well, if we put these trails in, how much more do we need to cut in the future? So any decision you make will be one about level of service. It will be about your capacity to cut grass and get into vegetated areas and determine which is natural and which is going to be mowed and manicured. So it's a bigger issue for us. I think there's going to be one that this council needs to consider in terms of going forward. Right now, we have numerous areas that are growing natural, and I've asked our staff, in actual fact, to start to map out all of our areas in the community to see exactly what we're dealing with before we make a final decision or make a recommendation on what the council should do going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Osmond. Any further comment from councillors? Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Ms. Gardner, for the presentation and your concern. I'm very sorry that you feel this is a level of service issue. I don't personally see it that way. I believe we should have more naturalized areas in town. I think they offer many environmental and social benefits as well as privacy. So I don't necessarily believe that a monoculture of grass is more beautiful in this case. Budgets aside, whether mowing or not is an economic issue, but I think fundamentally we need to have more of these corridors for nature. And I would think that over time having that nature in proximity to your home would be a benefit, but I understand not everybody feels that way. But I guess where I'm going is that even the areas that you've shown that are mown in this case, I think could be naturalized to the benefit of the town and the environment in general. So I don't necessarily agree with the approach that mowing is the way to go.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Your Worship. My good friend, Councillor Peters, I feel like I'm always on the other side on these things, so I apologize, but I don't see it as beautiful or a natural environment anyway. I see it as ugly, and it looks like it's not maintained. On top of that, I see a subdivision that we have up there, and this is political. We can all say what we want, but I think there's a subdivision in that section of town that's being ignored. We've got a whole area that's not developed. They've only got one way in. We've got a request here to have a small area cut. I don't think the area needs to be cut on a weekly basis. It doesn't have to look pristine. It doesn't need to look like a golf course. But I think if we were in there 4 or 5 times a year cutting this and making it look a little bit better than the pictures that we're seeing here, it would be a wise thing to do. So my vote would be to support this initiative and have the lawn cut. Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay. I'm tending to lean towards supporting whatever decision has been made to this point, which has obviously been in consultation with the conservation authorities and horticulturalists and determination by previous councils to create more naturalized areas. We've heard talk about pollinator gardens, about wildflowers and the need to have those. I personally haven't walked it, so I'm just looking at these photos at this point. I'm looking at a satellite view of this. It's not a large area actually involved, so cost-wise, it probably isn't significant to increase that. But again, the argument of naturalized area is one that I've kind of bought into. I've seen it, Councillor Peters will remember when we did tree planting off Fenley Park there, the pathway leading down to that underpass has all been naturalized, and additional trees were planted to encourage that. And you know, when you go underneath that underpass, underneath Riddell Road again, in that naturalized area, and it seemed to me to be quite nice, actually. I mean, so without walking it, I'm going to have to hold my further comment, but I do support what Councillor Taylor is saying, that neighborhood has been somewhat neglected, and we need to do a little bit more there. But at this point, I would say until we get some further understanding of what naturalization means to this town and what tact we're going to take, I would stay the course right now until we get further information. So, Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Once again, to Mr. Osmond, am I correct in hearing you say that you're going to be looking into this in the future as to what the cost would be, et cetera? And if that is the case, I think we should hold off making any decision tonight until that particular study is done or a report is done, but that's up to council, but thank you.
Mr. Osmond, are you actually active in looking at costs for this or not?
That is correct, Your Worship. The question came up several times in the discussions, and we want to go back and revisit exactly what we have and what our cost is right now, because we're going into a budget process in the next few weeks, and it'd be one we want to answer for council.
And again, to Mr. Osmond, have you started to map this on our GIS system, and do we have any understanding of our naturalized areas in town?
We do have an understanding of the naturalized areas, but we're looking at them in terms of acres and hectares, so we can get a good idea of the size we're looking at. And we're also looking at it from our future perspective, because we're looking at our trails master plan and identifying where these trails are going and whether or not we will have the same abutting properties with some of these trails, and if that will be an issue going forward.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sherwood.
Through you, Your Worship, I have a question, then a comment. My question is to staff, not exactly sure who, perhaps Mr. Osmond or Mr. Ward. When you're talking about this area already being allocated in as part of naturalization, was this part of a subdivision agreement?
Mr. Osmond.
Your Worship, through Councillor Sherwood, yes, indeed, it was part of a subdivision agreement. There's also one that rides with the purchase and sale of properties. And if a person who lives in this property right now were to sell their property, it would ride with their sale again. It's an item that's actually specified in the agreement.
So I guess my follow-up comment is that as people are purchasing there, that's all part of the duties of their research for purchasing in that area. I do take a bit of offense on a couple of my fellow councillors saying that they're neglected. I don't feel that area of town is neglected. People have chosen to live in that area, and I don't know, I think that's sending a bad vibe to say they're neglected over there. I certainly don't feel that way at all. But again, in researching, when you're purchasing wherever you're buying, if you want to see what's surrounding your surroundings, you have the opportunity to research, and that would have been in the subdivision agreement, whether it be through your lawyer or your own research.
Thank you, Councillor Sherwood. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I guess to me, as I look through these pictures and I see that we're cutting the strip there, at this point in time, if we're going to delay, which it sounds like we will, is delay, my suggestion would be is that we cut now and do a charity cut or a courtesy cut and fix the issue that we have here and make it look more appealing. And then next year, when this information becomes available, then we could do something more longer term. And just to answer the comments from Councillor Sherwood, perhaps I used the wrong terminology when I say neglected. That was in the presentation, and I would say that neighborhood who only has one way in and they're big homes and pay a large amount of taxes, I don't feel good about it. So to me it feels, if neglected is the wrong word, we'll find something else, but I think that subdivision is not being looked after right now. So that would be my take, respectfully.
Councillor Post.
Thank you. Based on the comments we've heard so far, I just wanted to clarify with Mr. Osmond, if possible, through you, Mr. Mayor. You had mentioned that there's an agreement in place, so we could be in violation of a contract which would have legal ramifications if we were to do, as Councillor Taylor suggested, a one-time cut while we waited on this, correct?
Mr. Osmond.
That is correct. If we, going forward, wanted to change the agreement, I guess we got to go back and revisit the agreement. Would that be the process to follow? But right now, you do have an agreement in place, and it actually is an agreement that arrives with the purchase and sale of all the homes. So likewise, if a property owner were to cut the grass around that area in these naturalized areas, they too would be in breach of contract.
So if I may continue. Again, I appreciate Ms. Gardner's perspective. I can see what your perception of the area is, and likewise, I can see that the naturalized area is great. So my suggestion going forward would be perhaps that we move this on to staff. I don't know if we need a motion to do that report to figure out what the next steps are, and what that contract negotiation would look like if we wanted to take that path, just to present council with a couple of options of how we could move forward.
In order to amend the existing agreement, the subdivision agreement. Is that what
Right,
you're saying?
just to figure out exactly where council is at this point, if we wanted to amend the agreement or if we want to keep it naturalized. I think that we need some more information from staff before we can move forward on this in any way, shape, or form tonight.
Okay. Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and not to go tete-a-tete with Councillor Taylor, but my thoughts on the cut are that it takes much more effort to renaturalize a space than it does to maintain its natural existence at this point. So I think the cut would undo essentially what has been growing there for several years and the diversity that is gained over that time. So from that perspective, again, I think leaving it in its natural state until we decide what the formal long-term plan is for the space is the bigger benefit to the town.
Okay, I think we might have, Councillor Sherwood, I'm sorry.
And just to add a little bit, I guess, with respect to what Councillor Post was indicating, if we go ahead and do it under this circumstance, and we're breaking the contract, the subdivision agreement, I worry about this opening up a whole can of worms on several subdivision agreements within. So again, it's the due diligence of the people that are purchasing in that area to read everything, and I know we don't want to read pages and reams of paperwork, but again, going back to researching where you're purchasing.
Okay, one more with Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, I apologize, everybody. I don't mean to belabor the issue, but I love nature just as much as everybody else. As soon as this meeting is over, I'm going up to the lake. I can't wait to stare at the water. It's beautiful. This is not beautiful. This is not pleasant to look at if you live there. So I really feel like we're making a mistake. I know I'm going to lose this one. I can tell by the comments and appreciate what everybody's saying, but I think we're making a mistake here.
Fair enough. Okay, does somebody want to make a motion here to direct staff on this issue? Okay, Deputy Mayor McIntosh? Which is? Okay. Okay, so just to be clear, Mr. Osmond, so you're going to look at this in terms of the cost and also the implications of cutting this with respect to the subdivision agreement and what the implications of that are?
Yes, Your Worship. And the other thing that came up, of course, is that you're quite right, Councillor Sherwood. I mean, there's lots of agreements, so now we would have to take a look at it because right now you are in agreement, so a decision's been made, and what do we do going forward is more important than what we're doing right now. The issue of mowing these areas has been dealt with in the agreement, and the naturalization of Orangeville, if you would, green spaces in Orangeville has been dealt with by previous councillors in some degree to yourselves, because you've also touched on this as well in the sustainability plan,
SNAP plan. Yeah.
which again deals with pollinators, planting more naturalized areas and so on and so forth. So it's a question for us right now, because it's a little timely, is whether or not we consider these areas going forward, yes, from a naturalization perspective, but also from a budget perspective on what it would cost to change how we deliver that service.
Okay, and What kind of timeline do you think you need, Mr. Osmond, to report back?
Well, we're working on it right now. We'd like to report back during the budget process, if you would.
Okay. All right, so I guess so Ms. Gardner, that is the motion that's on the floor, that we're going to look at this. We're going to take some further advice from staff and revisit this in the near future. So do we have a seconder for Deputy Mayor McIntosh? Councillor Taylor? Any further comment from councillors? No. I'll call the vote. All in favor? And opposed? Okay. Councillor Sherwood is opposed. So that will pass. We'll look into this and we'll be reporting back to you. Okay? Thank you very much. Next delegation, Monica Nelson, unregulated cats. Monica, welcome.
I'm not sure how my pictures they will go. Maybe that will be next presentation. Good evening, Mr. Mayor Brown and City Council Committee. Thank you so much for giving me opportunities, 5 minutes to present my point of view. I really appreciate it. I'm here today to increase regulation towards cats in Orangeville, introduce new law, poops and scoop cats, feces keeps cats inside homes or on the leash, perhaps introduce new license. Nothing else than for the last 2 days I was putting this presentation together in my head, which direction I should go to something obvious, which for example, pictures I should have here, showing how many diseases can be transmitted through the cats, diseases and sicknesses, and also through the cat's poo. I'm representing mothers, fathers, parents, grandparents of the kids. And I don't want to even mention the kids in age 1 or 2. I'm also mention my kid, which is 5 years old. We moved to the new neighborhood a year ago, which is close to the conservation area. We have a lot of cats in this area. I'm having an issue, personal, with some of the cats poo on my front yard and backyard. And my son personally is not allowed to even walk without shoes, not even enjoying their own property. I'm here also today to represent another group of the people. A couple weeks ago, I read an article in our Banner magazine. The lady was expressing her unhappiness, just expressing stuff simple like some people, they like to feed birds. Some people, they like animals such as squirrels, rabbits, etc., etc. The cat is allowed to come to the property and just kill these animals. We have the kids, they can see it. We need to think also about the elderly people in our neighborhood. Somebody who is depressed, somebody who is sick. We're supposed to live together, integrated, and with full respect. Some people, they try to put their veggie gardens. Another person would like to flowers as me. Having kids, having dogs, having cats, and etc., etc. We didn't supposed to just, we should be integrated, not to really disturb each other. Also, I have been told that a couple years ago, it was another group of the people with the petition and signature coming from Orangeville to the previous mayor about the same issue, and the case was rejected. I think we cannot stuck in old ages. When I Google, I found straight away information, for example, all dogs and cats owned in Toronto, so I believe GTA area, must be licensed and wear tag. The same right now is about the town of Guelph. I don't know, even maybe more towns as well are participating. I absolutely understand how difficult made before our town to introduce this law and enforce the law with the police. Police here is very small location, and to respond for the telephone calls, hey, I have a poo of the cat, hey, I have a poo of the dog, may be stupid. However, please guess what? It's another point that why basically I'm here. I'm having a private issue with the particular one cat who is entering my property straight away from the neighbors. My front yard this year is just covered by poo and pee of this cat. cat is allowed to be all the nights outside and sometimes all the days. So obviously, poo and pee, whatever it is, this year has happened to me. We started to renovate our backyard, so I believe moved his business to the front yard. I'm saying covered. So please just think about the smell is coming in temperature plus 30 and 40. When we go and address situation with the neighbors, and I'm not talking about personal case, just general also in Orangeville, the owners of the cat, they said, it's not regulated, what you can do. The cat can, maybe you can come and see, help me with this situation, or just start and clean this poo and pee. So I think the police was already involved in my case. We spent 2 hours on the police station because the situation escalated between me and my neighbor in the front of my kid. So I would like to have this regulation, feel safe and free on my backyard. And I believe that I'm not the only one here in Orangeville speaking on behalf of the people. And again, I'm putting a stress. I consider myself quite brave today, being here, but we have people like elderly people in certain ages. We have, again, depressed, maybe sick people. They would like to enjoy their yards. They would like to enjoy their own property, and we cannot do it. So would you please consider putting some restriction on the cat's owner? You own animal, whatever it is, cat or dog or crocodile, whatever it is, you're taking full responsibility. I'm taking responsibility for my child. My child doesn't go to someone's backyard and do poo and pee. So I would like to see the same. We should live really with respect. The only way when is just the regulation and help us just sort it out this big problem.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sympathetic. You mentioned police. I think that's not going to happen. We just have, there'll be no opportunity for our police officers to be responding to animal control issues unless
Exactly.
it's a very serious event. Have you tried any repellents of any sort? Any, and they're ineffective?
No, nothing is affected. Cats are very territorial, so they just are very clean animals. They don't do business in their own, I would say, yards. They do outside. So yes, whatever I spent lots of money putting different type of from Home Depot purchase or Canadian Tire stuff, which they have a certain smell. So the cat is moving from 1 meter to another, and after a rain, everything is washed out. So the biggest problem we noticed early spring when on our side of the house, basically basement window was covered by the poo. We cleaned up, we covered the window. So the cats goes, does the business, and return. And the problem is bigger because in my neighborhood, as I mentioned, there is a lot of cats as well. Some of the cats spray their smell, the other cats are attractive to spray as well. So this is not a good area. So I'm cleaning, and I don't even want to mention that I'm collecting flowers, and I started my new collection, and I have some flowers, those are irises, I purchased for $60. So cat literally goes and just cover their poo or pee. Obviously, more softer and nicer area it is, the cat does the business over there. So it is multiple times a day, and it's
Is this
nothing
one
I can
cat?
do.
Is this, because this is one hell of a cat.
The
Yeah,
other cats are coming as well occasionally. I wouldn't be here if it's happening sometimes. I will clean once a week, twice a week, no problem. But when it's my house and the front yard, my door, main door, it's a toilet, I'm having an issue with this.
right. Wow. Counselor Peters, do you have a thought about this, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll just weigh in briefly. I have heard this issue from other citizens. I understand other municipalities either have a program or are looking into programs. I'm also aware that our staff is busy doing a variety of things, and that whether it's the bylaw officer or the police or any sort of regulatory body enforcing it is obviously very difficult. So I guess I don't have a resolution. I would mind seeing this concept brought to the table at some point. I'm not prepared to ask staff to do it at the moment, given the current workload and number of issues that are piling up, but I can certainly understand where you're coming from, and you're not the only person who's brought it up with me, so that's my perspective.
Any further comments from councilors? No. Okay, so I think, Ms. Nelson, at this point, we're going to receive the information that you've given us. We're coming into our budget season. Town staff is buried. We have a new town clerk who's looking at a number of different bylaw issues. I think what Councillor Peter is suggesting is that we're concerned about this. We need to look at it. I don't know that we've got a timeline here, though. Anybody suggest a timeline? Madam Clerk?
I think it might be helpful. We're just going through the process in the clerk's area of looking at the various regulatory bylaws and the bylaws that we're responsible for enforcing and prioritizing the review of those particular bylaws. So certainly as we compile that list and bring that forward to council to consider, we can then look at what a timeline might be.
Are you aware, though, is it true that there is no current regulation for cats in this town?
That's correct, there is not.
Okay. Councillor Peters.
If I could then, through you to the clerk, would it be better for us to approve this in principle and put a lengthier time frame on it, or would you rather see this just come back when perhaps things have steadied a little bit?
Madam Clerk.
I would recommend that once we bring forward a list of the review and the timeframes for the review, that if council chooses to add that to the priority list and look at the timeline of when that would be reviewed, to include it at that time.
Okay, so we're on board with your complaint. We understand it. What you've described is not something that we want to see happening, and we need to correct it, and we need to look at how to do that. So, but at this moment, we don't have any immediate action, but I want to thank you for coming and bringing this to our attention again, and we will remember it, and it will be looked after. Okay? Thank you. Next presentation is our climate change coordinator, Allison Miles. Allison.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. So my name is Allison Miles, and I'm the town's climate change coordinator. For those who don't know me, over the next year or year and a half or so, I will be working on the development of the corporate climate adaptation policy and plan for the town. So tonight's presentation is just kind of going to provide a brief summary of some local climate projections for Orangeville, as well as some information on adaptation at the municipal level. And finally, we are going to review the draft of the climate adaptation policy that we've developed. So I want to start by reviewing some local climate projections for the town of Orangeville. So the annual average temperature in Orangeville has actually already increased from 5.4 degrees between 1950 to 1979 to 6.2 degrees between 1980 and 2009. So under a business as usual global emissions scenario, we do anticipate that annual average temperatures in Orangeville will continue to increase to 7.5 degrees by the 2020s, 9.5 degrees by the 2050s, and finally 11.5 degrees, so almost doubling by the end of the century. So looking at some seasonal temperatures, average, minimum, and maximum daily temperatures are projected to significantly increase across all 4 seasons. The greatest increase in maximum temperature will take place during the summer months, resulting in more frequent and prolonged heat events. And the greatest increase in minimum temperatures is expected to occur during the winter months, which will likely lead to changes in the frequency and timing of our freeze-thaw cycles, as temperatures will likely be hovering around the 0-degree mark much more often. Looking at temperature extremes, we are expected to see a significant decline in the amount of cold days we are going to have in Orangeville by the end of the century. Currently, we experience almost 30 days a year where temperatures fall below -15 degrees. As you can see, by the 2080s, we can expect to see less than 2 days of the year with temperatures this low. On the other extreme, the number of days with temperatures above 30 degrees are expected to actually increase considerably over time, with the number of heat days increasing up to 60 days by the 2080s. So switching over to precipitation, we are expected to see an increase of over 100 millimeters in total annual precipitation over the century, but projections also indicate that the nature and patterns of these precipitation events may have greater impacts on our community as opposed to the increase in total annual precipitation itself. So diving into that a bit more, looking at seasonal precipitation, it is projected that Orangeville will experience an increase in precipitation during the winter, spring, and fall. However, as you see here on the graph, you will see that we're going to actually experience a decrease in precipitation during the summer. It's also important to consider that with warming temperatures, we should expect to see a lot more rainfall as opposed to snowfall in the winter and shoulder seasons. And also projected climate conditions will also increase the potential for more frequent freezing rain events during these seasons as well. Looking at extreme precipitation, as we see, the number of days with precipitation exceeding 10 and 20 millimeters will increase quite steadily over time. The number of precipitation events below 10 millimeters are actually projected to remain relatively stable. So with quite a substantial increase in total annual precipitation, this indicates that the intensity of these precipitation events will actually be increasing quite significantly over time. So that's just a really quick, brief summary, but in general, climate projections indicate that the town will experience warming temperatures, increased variability in precipitation patterns, and much more frequent extreme weather events. So what does this mean for the town? These changes in climate do have the potential to profoundly impact the town's assets, operations, and services, including risks to our natural environment, public health and safety, community services, economic growth, and infrastructure and assets. So therefore, there is an urgency for us to begin preparing and planning for these impacts to minimize and eliminate the risks where possible and just build our overall community resilience. So most of you will obviously recognize that picture there. It's taken from June 2017 when we did experience quite severe flooding as a result of an extreme precipitation event. So now I just wanted to go over kind of the two main areas of climate change work now that we've looked at some projections. So this is just to eliminate any confusion and make sure that we're clear on kind of the two main areas. So they are climate mitigation and climate adaptation. A lot of the conversation on climate change is focused on the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and this is known as climate mitigation. So reducing emissions of greenhouse gases across the globe is vitally important for fighting climate change in order to reduce the extent of future warming. However, no matter how much we reduce our emissions now, unfortunately, concentrations of greenhouse gases from the past and current activities are already locked into our atmosphere, so we know that we are going to experience some climate change impacts. So since we know the impacts are coming, this is why we should begin preparing our communities, and this is why we're starting to. Thinking ahead, being proactive can reduce our vulnerability to the adverse impacts of climate change and help us take advantage of any potential opportunities as well. This is what's called climate adaptation. So climate adaptation can take many forms, including small shifts in individual behavior, changing the way we plan our communities, as well as major overhauls to critical infrastructure to increase our overall climate resilience. The town of Orangeville was successful in gaining funding from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to develop a corporate climate adaptation plan. So our focus here is adaptation, but I just wanted to note, as the graphic highlights, that there is quite a bit of overlap. So during our work on adaptation throughout the next few years, we definitely will also bring in mitigation efforts where we can as well to take advantage of those co-benefits where possible. So what can the town do to begin preparing for the impacts associated with climate change? So although the need for adaptation planning is clear, and council has already recognized it as being critical, it's important to note that there's no one way to approach planning for climate change. Adaptation, by its definition, is responding to local impacts, and therefore there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So it must be tailored to our community. We do have a unique opportunity here. As a municipality, we are the first to respond to the impacts of climate change and therefore have an interest in preparing for them. So I just wanted to kind of go over some examples of regional and municipal governments in Ontario that have already started to push adaptation planning forward. And this is generally in response to observed climate change impacts in their communities. So some examples include considering climate change in relevant areas of business and decision-making, including incorporating it into their official plans, while others have also listed climate adaptation and resilience as a priority in their strategic plan. Other examples could include assessing training needs for staff to ensure that there's an informed response to extreme weather events when they do occur, as well as retrofitting our infrastructure that we already know is susceptible to climate change impacts, investing in more town-owned green infrastructure and LIDs, which would also include increasing our urban tree canopy to meet the standards for mitigating extreme heat. Implementing cooling centers outside of normal business hours is another example, as well as mapping vulnerable areas to flooding, and increasing just overall public awareness and education on our local climate change impacts and what the town's doing to adapt. So really the main focus that we kind of wanted to get through tonight is that we have drafted a climate adaptation policy for the town. The policy establishes a commitment to advancing climate adaptation efforts across the corporation to manage, minimize, or eliminate the local risks and impacts associated with climate change. The policy also recognizes the responsibility of the town to incorporate climate change considerations into all relevant areas of business and decision-making processes. So these considerations will be largely informed by the findings that we do throughout our assessment work this coming year. Finally, the policy will support the long-term implementation of the corporate climate adaptation plan that we're working on, and will ensure that the plan will be monitored and updated over time. So a draft of the policy is included as an attachment to the corporate climate adaptation policy report in tonight's agenda for review by council. We plan to incorporate any feedback and recommendations that we receive tonight, and we will return to council with the final policy for approval in the fall. So I just wanted to wrap up by looking at kind of where we're at and what our next steps are and associated timelines. So we have built an internal climate action team, which is made up of town staff with various expertise that we will be drawing upon throughout the development of our corporate climate adaptation plan. So far, we have worked on identifying some existing policies, plans, and operations that the town already has in place and that support adaptation efforts. We've also reviewed local climate projections, which has resulted in the identification of over 50 climate impacts that we'll be assessing for vulnerability this coming fall. Currently, we're working on gaining the approval of the climate adaptation policy, which will allow us to move forward with our efforts. And as mentioned, that draft is attached to tonight's agenda. This fall, we'll be moving forward with the completion of our vulnerability assessment, followed by a risk assessment, hopefully in the winter or early spring. These findings will determine vulnerable assets and service areas and also help us prioritize risks for the town. From here, we'll develop some adaptation measures for key risks for the town, and then we'll look at implementation tools and key performance indicators that we can use to evaluate effectiveness of the measures over time. Throughout the entire process, we will be informing the public through different community events, and after we complete the vulnerability and risk assessment, we will be planning some more formal workshops and engagement events for the public to ensure that the priorities that we have identified align with those of the community as well. And then once we gain approval for the climate adaptation policy, we plan to report back to council with an update on the completion of our vulnerability and risk assessments, with the anticipated timeline of that being early spring 2020. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks for your attention tonight, and I do look forward to hearing any feedback or comments you guys have on the corporate climate adaptation policy.
Thank you very much. Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have any specific comments at this time on the policy, but just for the benefit of everyone in the room and online, obviously these are measures that need to be approached on a larger scale to have a real impact. So could you speak on how you're collaborating with the county, who also has a similar position in this field, and how this policy and perhaps their policy will interact?
Closely with the county, as they also hired a climate change coordinator around the same time period as the town. Their focus is kind of they're swapped to ours. Their focus is actually on climate mitigation, so they're looking mainly at greenhouse gas emissions, but they have the same outlook as us, as it's better to kind of approach both initiatives together. So I've been meeting regularly with Sarah Wicks, the county's climate change coordinator, to ensure that our initiatives are aligning and that when we are developing adaptation measures along with mitigation measures, we're doing that together and simultaneously to ensure that they support one another.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned floodplain mapping in there. Has there been any work on that?
In some work, it's been fairly scoped down. I'm not aware of a town-wide flood vulnerable map or floodplain mapping. CBC has done extensive work on pockets of town that has been vulnerable to flooding in the past, I'm aware of. But some of that is also hard to transfer to future climate projections. So in terms of lots of the floodplain mapping is based on current conditions. So we will be working with CBC some too, hopefully in the future, to incorporate the future climate projections into that floodplain mapping so we can plan our community.
Okay. The other question I wanted to ask staff is, when we procure things, is there any consideration for vendors as far as their green initiatives? And do we include that in any kind of point system where we evaluate vendors? Mr. Brennan?
Your Worship, I would have to look closer at our policy, but there is a statement to reflect on green or the environment in our policy. We haven't gone to a green procurement per se because that is often a large additional cost, but it is something that we can look at going forward. There is a statement in our policy for it, and a consideration. Of course, we can put that then in our, if it's an RFP, for the evaluation for consideration.
Well, I think most corporations are trying to, embrace this, and it'd be nice to deal with those companies that are doing more than others. So just a thought, maybe to incorporate that going forward. Thank you. Allison, thank you very much for your presentation. Any further questions from councilors? No? Okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to go into our statutory public meeting. Deputy Mayor McIntosh is going to take the chair. Sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a few notes before we get started. The purpose of this public meeting is to inform and provide the public with the opportunity to ask questions or to express views with respect to the development proposal. Council is here to listen to the comments made to council. Will not make a decision on the matter this evening. The town requests that you please complete the notification list on the table if you wish to be on record and would like to be notified of future meetings and decisions regarding this application. Note that any information collected on the notification list is a public record. So first, we'll start off with a presentation by our town planning staff. Mr. Ward.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to those in attendance or those who may be observing online. So just to reiterate, tonight's public meeting does form a statutory part of the planning process with respect to applications that have been filed to the town in support of a development proposal. So earlier this year, in March, we received applications to amend the town's official plan and zoning bylaw from an agency referred to as Trolley Bus Urban Development Incorporated on behalf of Saberwood Homes. The applications intend to facilitate a proposed 41-unit townhouse development. So the subject lands are situated on the west side of First Avenue, immediately adjacent to the 4th Avenue intersection. They're comprised of 4 separate properties with a total lot area of approximately 0.8 hectares or just under 2 acres. They have approximately 81 meters of frontage collectively along First Street, and they're just situated to the north of Feed Street. So the subject lands contain 4 single detached dwellings that exist on the properties, with 1 dwelling situated on each of the 4 properties. As you'll see in the slide in front of you, the lands are fairly well vegetated. Surrounding lands consist of a recently developed 41-unit townhome development immediately to the south, single detached residential dwellings to the west on Sunset Drive, a 3-story apartment building immediately to the north on also on First Avenue, or First Street, sorry, and as well as an apartment dwelling unit and existing commercial uses within converted dwelling units to the east, opposite First Street. So the site plan concept is illustrated on the slide in front of you. It consists of an internal roadway to serve access to the townhouse units. The access onto First Street is proposed to align with the First Avenue intersection. And as you'll see, there are approximately 7 units that are proposed to have pedestrian-oriented frontage onto First Street with vehicular access afforded from the internal laneway. So the official plan designates the subject property as restricted commercial residential. So this designation is really identifies those areas along the First Street and Broadway corridors that provide an interconnecting linkage from the commercial areas more on the periphery of the town towards the central business district. And for those reasons, the uses permitted include both commercial and residential uses. Specifically, the residential uses permitted by the restricted commercial residential policies include detached, semi-detached, duplex, and triplex dwelling units. So because those units don't contemplate the townhouse development proposed for this site, this warrants the need for an amendment application for the official plan. So the subject properties are also identified as an intensification area within the official plan, and there's a couple of points I want to mention with respect to intensification areas. The official plan overall contains policies that are supportive for intensification and redevelopment within the built-up area, and there's good planning fundamental reasons behind that. It provides for a more efficient use of land and infrastructure resources, and provides for a more efficient delivery of our public services when you have more growth occurring within your built boundary as opposed to growing broadly outside of your boundary. In order to achieve these intensification directions, the official plan policies actually state a prescribed target, encouraging for every year for all new residential development, about 50% of that should be occurring within the built boundary. In order to achieve that intensification target, the official plan deploys a series of identified intensification areas. These areas are typically vacant or underutilized lots within the town that are seen to be potential candidate sites for future intensification or redevelopment. Now, I want to note that these policies aren't an as-of-right permission for redevelopment. The policies do say that intensification proposals would be evaluated with respect to the appropriateness of that development relative to their surroundings, and also too with respect to servicing and other means. So the slide before you illustrates more specifically the amendments being sought. One is to redesignate the lands from the restricted commercial residential designation to residential designation, and also to identify the lands as a medium density residential designation on the town's residential density plan. So similarly, the zoning bylaw amendment application has been filed to rezone the subject lands from restricted commercial residential or C5 zone to a multiple residential zone category. The amending zoning bylaw would include special provisions that are more reflective of the proposed built form with the development. So it would include specific setbacks, lot coverage, lot area provisions, et cetera, that may be different from the prevailing zoning bylaw requirements. The site is also currently subject to a holding symbol restriction and is proposed to be maintained as part of the amendment being requested. The holding symbol is one that essentially freezes future development or uses from proceeding until such time as the conditions of the holding symbol restriction are satisfied. Particularly with this holding symbol, it pertains to the receipt of satisfactory plans to service and develop the lands. So at a future point in time, there'd be another application coming forward to remove that holding symbol once we have those plans better understood. So as is customary with any planning application review, the submission was circulated to our internal departments and external public agencies for review and comment. The agencies listed on the slide in front of you are some of those that have expressed no concern thus far with the applications. There have been some specific comments received from certain agencies, particularly the school boards, with respect to student yield accommodation. Our fire division has also just requested some confirmation on the fire access delineation and provision of fire hydrants, et cetera. Infrastructure Services has noted that their more detailed review of the application or the proposed development would occur at a time at a forthcoming site plan approval application process. I also want to note that since the application notice was advertised earlier this year, we have received some comments from residents with respect to general questions or concerns raised with respect to the proposal, particularly as it relates to increased runoff or drainage challenges within the general vicinity of the site. Questions about changes in differences of grade between the subject lands and their surroundings. What are the traffic impacts as a result of this proposed development? And two, there's been some interest in seeing some of the existing vegetation, particularly around the periphery of the site, being maintained as this proposal proceeds through its review and approval process. So essentially, the next steps are to take the information we receive at tonight's meeting back into consideration in conjunction with the comments received through the circulation review and share that with the applicant for their response. And at a point in time where it's determined that the comments and the review process has yielded a satisfactory review of the applications, staff would then be in a position to bring forward a recommendation report for council's consideration. Following which, when a decision is made on the applications, presumably the applicant would then proceed with the more detailed site plan review and application submission process. So that concludes my presentation. I understand the applicant is also here and will be making their own presentation, which will explain a little more details about the proposed development, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Now we'll have comments by Greg Gilbert on behalf of the applicant, Trolley Bus Urban Development.
Good evening. Just going to get my bearings here. I was used to the old standing up podium in the old council chambers, but this is not too bad. So as mentioned, I'm here on behalf of the home builder Saberwood Homes. We're working together on this development application, as well as the Saberwood will be building the actual project out. So just some quick context. I don't want to duplicate too much of what Brandon said, but just in the general context, we're kind of in a transition area between the general commercial area closer to Highway 10, between Broadway and that. As Brandon mentioned, the existing uses today are just 4 single detached homes. Many of them built in the 50s and 60s, and then there's an older home located at 64 First Street. They're currently vacant with the property manager. And then looking at the existing context, as mentioned, there's an apartment to the north that was subject to an official plan amendment in 2002 to medium density, and then the existing townhomes to the south, which are now built, also subject to an official plan amendment to medium density in 2014. And then you have existing residential uses to the west along Sunset Drive, some bungalows that were built, I think, around the 50s and 60s. And then kind of an eclectic mix on the east side with apartments and general commercial residential uses. Just for the applicants, or sorry, the public in the room, to give them an idea of the timeline. So we met with staff last year, submitted a preliminary plan, got some feedback from engineering and other departments on that plan, and then we submitted a full application on March 5th for the official plan amendment and zoning. We've received full comments from a variety of agencies and staff, and we're looking for some comments from yourself and the public this evening. We'll take those comments to heart, tweak the plans as needed, and take the next 2-3 months to likely resubmit a plan back to staff for their review. So we're here at the consultation meeting, and as Brandon mentioned, the zoning approval does not permit construction for those in the room. There's a very technical exercise called site plan approval, which would look at the things like pipe capacity and traffic movements. We've already began some of that work as it's required for the initial zoning, but you're probably looking about 4 to 6 months following council approval of the rezoning before you see any sort of activity on the site. So just kind of following on this general idea of intensification, provincial policies, county policies, town policies are all looking and saying, in order to use land efficiently, intensification is required, and that's putting people closer to schools, closer to amenities, recreation, the downtown. This is a direction that we're seeing throughout Ontario, and it helps bring life and walkable neighborhoods to areas like Orangeville. So this is something that we believe in, and it's illustrated in the project. Back in 2016, council and staff did source a consultant to look at a variety of intensification sites that many were already in the official plan and made it into the official plan. And through that study, there was 22 sites identified, and this was one of those. At the time, just an overview of looking at the development feasibility, it was assessed as potential for 50 units per hectare. Just for context, we're proposing 41 townhouse units, and that's about 51 units per hectare. So we're fairly consistent with the findings of that study that was approved back in 2016. Again, just looking at the building up intensification campaign and looking at gaining public awareness about the benefits of intensification and infill development to meet those things that we talked about: active living, air quality, safe neighborhoods, and investment in economic development. So just these are some of the agencies that we've received comments from, no different than Brandon illustrated. Okay, so this is probably the more important aspect for the audience, is the details of the site plan. So we're looking at 41 total townhomes. 7 of them will have front doors facing First Street proposed with garages in the back, and the additional 34 will be a traditional townhouse with 3 stories in height, between 1,500 and 2,000 square feet. These are family-friendly, minimum 3 bedrooms, potential for basements. And there's 1 car in the driveway, 1 car in the garage, and then we're proposing 10 visitor parking spaces. For the locals that have been to previous public meetings on the project to the south, that was something that was really important. They felt that they were underparked from a visitor parking perspective. We've taken that comment and added 3 additional stalls for a ratio of 0.25 visitor parking stalls per unit. That's, I would say, a little bit above what's typically standard throughout the GTA. So just wanted to note that. There's also 1 accessible stall, and backyards, garages, a variety of porches, terraces, and outdoor space depending on what type of unit is presented. A comment from traffic was to line up the center lines of the single access into the site with 4th Avenue, and that's from a safety perspective to eliminate conflict. That's something that we've incorporated. And one thing that's also been brought up through just conversations is the importance of mature trees along the perimeter. So we have hired an arborist. He's done a full inventory of the trees on site. They've been surveyed, their condition. So as part of the development, we'll be working with surrounding property owners to meet those needs and maintain some of the mature trees canopy around the outside. Again, just project considerations. These are family friendly. There's a bus stop right at the access. This is transit accessible, walkable to the secondary school and the public school. It's about 7 to 10 minute walk to Broadway. This is all stuff that the project exemplifies. So it's important to note Saberwood Homes is a company that's been around for over 40 years. Their legacy goes back to Orangeville, building homes here a little over 20 years ago. This is an example of the architecture that we're looking at. This is a project that's been recently completed in Brampton that was built by the builder, Saberwood Homes. It's on a larger scale, about 300 townhomes of this similar design. I just wanted to show the kind of hallmark of quality materials and brick and stone in line with kind of the feel of First Street and Broadway. That's something that we believe would work well. So this would be the traditional townhouse, and then this would be the potential frontage along First Street, what that might look like with the front doors uninterrupted, no driveways along First Street. You kind of have a good pedestrian environment with porches and windows and different elements to make it friendly. I'm just going to go through a couple sections of how this project would interact with its neighbors. This is what the proposed development and streetscape would look like along First Street. You see the 4 lanes of traffic, a boulevard, sidewalk, and then the front doors. And then at the back, you have the driveways. And then this is kind of what the pedestrian feel would look like. We envision a nicer sidewalk than that. Unfortunately, that's what's in Brampton. But this is kind of the idea when you're walking along First Street, what you might see. This is how the townhomes to the west, their rear yards would interact with the existing homes along Sunset Drive. So important to note that there's quite a grade change in this site, and there's quite a setback from those houses along Sunset Drive. So in total, between the 2 dwellings, there would be over 90 feet of separation, as well as a 3-meter grade change, as well as helping kind of mitigate that impact of these townhomes on those residents would be the existing canopy cover, the grade, and fencing that would be part of any typical development application. So that's something I wanted to point out. And then this would be a section of how they would, the backyard to backyard relationship with the existing townhomes perpendicular to First Street that are there today. Similar type of rear yard condition, similar height. There would be a fence between them and similar outdoor areas. And then just looking at just how the vehicles would enter and exit the site, how pedestrians would get north and south to the various amenities nearby. And then just looking at the visitor parking location and potential for mailbox and sidewalks and other things. So that's really it. I just wanted to give an overview of the project to you and get any feedback tonight and answer any questions as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Do we have any questions or comments from the public regarding this development? Please go up to the mic. Please state your name and address, please, when you get up there.
Sunset Drive, L9W2G9. One of the things that this gentleman here has just mentioned about this 4 lanes of traffic, one of the things that I guess it's bothering me as I look at this layout, and Brendan and I had already talked about this briefly, but I must admit I didn't realize what we were facing with in ending up with 2 entry and exit of the townhouse development directly opposite 4th Avenue. And at that point, First Street isn't really a full 4 lanes because you've got people trying to make left-hand turns down onto 4th Avenue. So therefore, the traffic flow, plus you've got people going in and out of this new 41 townhouse development, it's just going to be a continuous bottleneck. People rely upon the little portion of lane that is left there heading southbound so that they can go by the traffic that is now trying to, on the center lane kind of thing, trying to turn left onto 4th Avenue. So that is going to become quite a bottleneck. So I'm not sure exactly what the plan is there, but I think I had mentioned to a few people in town that I believe there was supposed to be at one point in time consideration for reconstruction on First Street where there's quite an extensive boulevard on the west side to allow an additional lane there, and that right now it basically narrows in sort of in around the area of the existing 41 townhouse development. This is a situation where we've now ending up going from a 41 townhouse development to effectively with this new phase to an 82 townhouse development, and with from my perspective, in my opinion, very little thought with regards to what we're going to do with regards to First Street. First Street definitely needs some sort of changes to it. I've had a number of discussions with people, even going back over the last 5 or 6 years, about the intersection at Feed Street and First Street, which there's a need to break up traffic flow on that street. The traffic is moving far, far too fast up and down that street. There's also, becomes a real problem with pedestrians even getting across First Street, students, seniors even from the likes of the Bromont and whatnot to go down and do their shopping at Zayre's. This street is definitely in need of some attention, particularly if we're now going to throw in another 41 townhouses. Within the last 5 to 6 years, I had a petition that I submitted to council at that time, going anywhere from the people who are either living on First Street or operating businesses on First Street, like Heritage Dental, all the way up to Elizabeth School. All these people that try and access down to the shopping areas and so on that are adjoining or adjacent to First Street are faced with this problem, and it's going to get worse before it gets better unless we do something about that reconstruction and look at that First Street seriously. Okay? And we also very concerned that people, students and seniors alike, this is not a good way, as I even explained to one of the previous councils, a way to treat seniors. Now force them into going all the way down to Fifth Avenue and or back to Elizabeth Street, which is where the 2 existing sets of traffic lights are, so they can get across and then come back to Zayre's. That's not a very good way to treat our seniors, for sure. And having watched students trying to get across First Street so they can get to ODSS High School and so on, it's similar to the people trying to drive out onto First Street. It's a Hail Mary exercise, and we're extremely lucky so far to date that somebody hasn't exactly been killed. There have been some accidents, I believe, at the intersection, and it's something that needs some serious attention. Anyway, that's basically all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Toms, and you are correct. There's been multiple accidents there. Anybody else like to speak? No? Mr. Gilbert, any comments on what's been said?
Just from a traffic perspective, we, as part of any development application, we have to prove that this works and it's safe, and we're not queuing and requiring traffic lights and new turning lanes. So that work's been completed, and we support the findings of the traffic study, which says that this can operate safely in its existing condition. One thing we did do was we originally had 2 access, one right in, right out. That was not deemed acceptable, so this is the revision and improvement over that. So that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. We'll now take questions from council, starting with Councillor Sherwood.
Through you, Chair McIntosh, to Mr. Ward. I have a couple of questions. First, I just want to have a better visual of how this is going to look. So if I compare this property to the 42 condominium units that are on the south, you're indicating you're going to put 41 in a 0.79 hectares, or for us old school, 1.95 acres. What is the size of that development to the south?
Through you, Chair, McIntosh to Councillor Sherwood. The sizes are is relatively the same. It as well, I believe, was comprised of 4 separate properties, roughly 2 acres in area. So essentially, the density provisions from the south are very much consistent with what is being proposed to the north.
And a follow-up question through you to Mr. Ward is, I see in your report, you're indicating that one of the properties, 64 First Street, right in the middle, is part of the non-designated properties within the Heritage District. And I see both yourself and the consultant has mentioned, or the developers mentioned about having input from other sources. So can you tell me the timeline as to when this would go to Heritage Orangeville for their approval?
Certainly, again, through you, Chair McIntosh. The applications were circulated to Heritage Orangeville. Again, that was earlier this year. I believe that was at a point in time before the committee was perhaps formally established. To date, I don't have any comments specifically from the committee, but we'll certainly revisit this with them and obtain their review and comment as part of this application review process.
Thank you. If you could forward that to me, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Mayor Brown.
Yeah, just a couple questions, Mr. Ward. So the driveway internally here is connecting to the south development, is that correct?
Through you, Chair McIntosh, the driveway aligns but does not connect, and that is a comment staff have noted through review of this, that perhaps there may be an opportunity to have those driveways connected.
Okay. Just, you know, that would provide additional egress there for both developments. And so to this point, there's been no discussion about an intersection, a lighted intersection at 4th with respect to this project. Mr. Ward?
Again, through you, Chair McIntosh, the traffic impact study submitted, what my understanding of it is that, as the applicant made note of, the study doesn't recommend any needed improvements in terms of intersection improvements or roadway improvements as a result of this development. The existing and projected conditions for traffic are not going to be impacted to an extent that would warrant those type of improvements as a result of the development.
Okay. And is that specific to the density, the number of units in that?
Again, through you, Chair McIntosh, it's based on the specific development that's been proposed, the specific number of units, et cetera. Staff continue to review this submission, specifically with respect to the traffic impact study, in terms of its accuracy, its appropriateness, et cetera. And as staff move forward with a recommendation on this, we'll certainly report back to you on the traffic study and its conclusions.
Right. Well, one final comment. What Mr. Tom said, I think, is correct, that the narrowing of the traffic at the exact spot where the egress from this development could cause issues. So having been a resident of Feed Street and knowing that intersection very well just to the south, it does need some additional work, and I hope we can devise a solution there that, I mean, I'm generally supportive of this development as long as the traffic issues can be resolved satisfactorily. So thank you.
Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Gilbert, a couple questions or comments. Perhaps this was a slip at the beginning, but it looked like you had an appendix on stormwater management. Maybe I saw that wrong as it was loading, but as I'm sure you know, we've had the climate change coordinator earlier, flooding impacts and extreme events. Obviously, we're taking 4 homes, turning them into 41 homes. Could you speak to potential solutions for the site? And just while I've got the mic here, I'll just say briefly, I noticed the comment as well from the school board regarding sidewalks, and I also support that concept of more sidewalks, if for nothing else but a visual tie into, you know, the pedestrian infrastructure within town. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I did attach that just because the comment was raised, now it's been asked, so how about that? One of the conditions of source water protection in this area, Dufferin County, is that when you develop a property, you can't create more surcharging or surplus water than before you developed. So there's many ways to do that, which is called low impact development techniques, which is keeping water on site longer. And a way that many of these infill townhouse developments are able to do that is through, this is called a storm tech system. And when it rains, rather than go directly into Orangeville's sewer, it collects into this storm tech system and slowly infiltrates through the gravel into the ground. And then once kind of the storm has passed, it's able to go into the system rather than just putting more burden on an already overcharged or surcharged system. So it's a very common approach on private developments, and this is something that would be owned by the condominium board and maintained, and it's very common throughout the GTA. So we're proud to present that, and that would be located under the visitor parking stalls. And I guess on sidewalks, that's something we'll definitely look at. Thanks.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair McIntosh. And Mr. Gilbert, thank you for your presentation. We live in a small town, so it's not hard to know people that live in the other development. So in preparation for this meeting, I called a few of them and asked some questions. You've addressed portions of them, but I'm fearful about the parking as we go forward. I know that you're meeting the 1.5 spots, and you've described what that would be, that someone can park in the garage and someone can park in the driveway. But I still fear that we're going to have issues. And as I talk to those people that are in the previous development, that's their biggest concern. And in particular, the visitor parking, if there's a way to increase it further from what it is, that would be great. Second to that is the handicap parking. You mentioned one handicap parking spot. You know, I think that's insufficient, and that was a concern that was brought up. And the third thing was snow removal. So in the wintertime, those parking spots, which are already precious, become less because of snow removal. And the thought from the residents that were in the current development was, is there a way to have those trucked out of there so that we're not eliminating? And I don't know if that's something that's brought up ahead of time or how that would go. But and then the last piece was from our friends council that live in the West End and who have been to see us about parking issues in the back, is could there be a, I want to call it a warning, and that's not right. It would be more of a prognostication that says, hey, if you're living here and you're an older family and you may have teenage children, you may want to think about this prior to purchasing here. And that would be, there's only 2 spots. If you have 4 drivers and 4 cars, perhaps this may not be a place that you'd want to consider living in. And we could just be proactive about it as opposed to, you know, having somebody come to council 10 years from now very upset about a development that they live in. The last piece I'd like to say is I'm very familiar with that development in Heart Lake. It's very nice, so I don't challenge the building ability of Saberwood Homes. It just concerns me thinking about the parking in particular. And just one other comment, Mr. McIntosh, if you could indulge me. Very nice to see Mr. Toms back at a council meeting. It says to me that we've probably done a good job because this is the first time that I remember seeing him speak to us. So I think this is a good thing. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Councillor Sherwood, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
On to some of just the snow storage, we've set areas aside in our site plan for that. We've taken a really detailed look at the things that didn't work in the one to the south, and I think that was definitely one of them. So that's just something we have accounted for. And visitor parking, I know it's an issue. I'm of the opinion that we've provided a fair amount and an improvement of what's there, but that's something we can definitely look at. That's it.
Can we also let families know prior to applying?
So an idea I have is that when we're building near railway tracks, we typically have a warning clause to say you're moving next to railway tracks. So maybe there's a warning clause in a purchase agreement that says you're only allocated these specific number of parking. Just something to consider. It's an idea. Thank you.
Councillor Sherwood.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Gilbert, thank you very much for your information. I have a couple of concerns. The development that is to the south, one of the things I've heard from there is the lack of opportunity for the children to play. They're literally playing on the road. And I'm wondering, is there anything, and maybe staff can confirm this with me, because I know in subdivisions there's always parkland that's supposed to be allocated. Is there any opportunity of a place of land to have like a little small playground area? Because I'm going to assume that most of the people, the demographics of people that are going to move in this neighborhood are likely going to have, you know, young families and with young children. And again, that place on the south, I've heard of people saying that the children have nowhere to play.
That's something we will take your feedback and look at opportunities. For this would be a private on-site parkette, but that's, at this time, we're not obviously showing what, but we'll take that feedback.
Thank you. Could perhaps staff clarify under what conditions that there must be some type of parkette or play area?
Sure. Through you, Chair McIntosh, to Councillor Sherwood, with respect to provision of parkland, the Planning Act affords the provisions to collect parkland or cash in lieu of. And the means of which you determine which one you collect is the nature of the development and what your Parks Master Plan says and your official plan says. Typically with a development of this nature, we would collect cash in lieu of parkland to provide for facilities elsewhere. As Mr. Gilbert noted, any proposed amenity area that may be included with this would be exclusive to serve the residents within that development, given that it would be under condominium ownership.
So I guess what I'm going back to is there are situations in different areas of town. I'm thinking 4th Street area. There's a little townhouse development there, and there's a little parkette, so at least some of the younger children can play there safely, if that's something you could take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I'd just like to remind people to complete the notification list if you'd like to be notified of future meetings and decisions regarding this application. That adjourn the public meeting now. If we could have a motion to receive the information, please. Councillor Sherwood, Councillor Peters. All in favor?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to revisit item 7.3, presentation by Allison Miles, and we need a motion from council to incorporate feedback and report back to council. Councillor Peters, any seconder? Councillor Taylor, all in favor? Okay, thank you. And then moving ahead, we have staff reports. So 10.1 is Orangeville Hydro Limited amended and restated unanimous shareholder agreement. Recommendation that the report CAO 2019-08 Orangeville Hydro Limited amended and restated unanimous shareholder agreement dated August 12th be received, and the council authorize the mayor and clerk to execute the amended and restated unanimous shareholder agreement attached to this report as attached number 1. And that a bylaw to authorize the entering into and execution of an agreement with the town of Grand Valley and Orangeville Hydro Limited regarding an amended and restated unanimous shareholder agreement is hereby read 3 times and passed. May I have a motion? Councillor Post, seconded by Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Any further comment on that? All in favor? Thank you. 10.2, this is council meeting schedule amendment. So we're adding September 5th, 2019 at 3 p.m., strategic planning session, and that on November 26th and December 16th, that we are added, I'm sorry, at November 26th and December 16th will be added to the scheduled budget meeting dates. May I have a motion? Councillor Post, seconded Councillor Taylor. All in favor? Thank you. We have the Community Living Dufferin Concession Agreement, which is a recommendation by staff. Report titled Community Living Dufferin Concession Agreement be received, and that the council approve the agreement between Community Living Dufferin and the town of Orangeville for the period August 30th, 2019 to December 30th, 2022, and the mayor and clerk be authorized to execute the said agreement and any other documents required to complete the transaction on behalf of the corporation of the town of Orangeville, to affix the corporate seal thereto. That a bylaw be authorize entering into an execution of an agreement with Community Living Dufferin regarding a concession agreement is hereby read 3 times and passed. May I have a motion? Deputy Mayor McIntosh, seconded by Councillor Taylor. All in favor? Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Peters, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to be the broken record here. When we discussed this agreement at a previous council meeting, we talked about incorporating environmental practices into the purchasing. I noticed it's sort of tucked away on the very back page and is basically a, where possible, recommended very, very soft language. I see this as an opportunity to get it into writing, to have a much more robust policy when it comes to single-use plastics and compostable materials, be it packaging, takeout, et cetera. So I'm not sure if we can sort of leave a space in here, perhaps, for Sustainable Orangeville to work with the town on crafting a bit of language, or whether everyone else thinks it's fine the way it is. But if there's an opportunity to beef up that language a little bit, I think now is our chance. And this can essentially, perhaps be a bit of a pilot for purchasing moving forward, as you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, sure, I'll get you a reference.
So would an amendment to have Sustainable Orangeville work together with Community Living Dufferin?
Yeah, whether it's Community Living Dufferin or the town, because in this case, the town is drafting the agreement. So in my package, I'm just going to have to scroll here for a second. It's in the terms of reference at the back. So once you get past all the legal pieces, I've got it on page 121 of my PDF, so page 27 of the actual agreement. It states, use and provide green, environmentally responsible options and procurement practices whenever possible. And I hate to say it, but that may be 0 times unless we actually get in there and be a little more descriptive. So I'd hate to see that fall flat.
Okay. Can you recommend a wording change that would be suitable to you? Sorry, Councilor Peters, go ahead.
Sure. I certainly don't want to hold up the agreement, and I don't want to compromise the timelines, but perhaps if that line, or, it could be something to the effect of Community Living Dufferin and Sustainable Orangeville to collaborate on wording surrounding a procurement policy to strengthen the environmental performance of that operation.
Mr. Osmond, do you see any issue with that?
Your Worship, through you, to Councillor Peters, I don't see an issue with it. I think our intent when we had the discussions on this particular issue was that they do follow environmentally good practices, but the question is, how exactly do you want to be specific with it? We can probably clarify it a little bit in terms of the wording to be a bit more succinct. Right now, for instance, as an example, we don't use any plastic straws. We've taken care of a lot of plastics. We use a lot of other products, cardboard and so on, to give things to the public. When it comes to this particular supplier, they've agreed that they too want to follow all green practices, and they operate other concessions doing likewise. It's the wording, be very specific with the wording. It's a concern, but we can go back and revisit it and see if we can get the wording a bit more succinct and be clear without they procure their products. But right now, they're going forward looking at procuring products that basically they're transitioning from where we are into some of the companies we already use. And right now we're using green procurement with those particular suppliers. But I agree with you. I understand what you're trying to say here. We'll go back and just tweak the wording a little bit to be very clear on what we expect the supplier to deliver, if that works.
Councillor Peters.
Certainly, thank you through you to Mr. Osmond. I appreciate the feedback, and I certainly don't mean to stifle the operations or the profitability of the endeavor, but I've seen it fall flat when it's left too broad. So if they are sweeping but very achievable statements, like not using styrofoam or not employing straws or sourcing compostable takeout containers, like, there's probably a few things we can touch on, and certainly the operation may go beyond that. But again, I worry with no one to look after following into that policy or those activities. Sometimes it's easier to sweep that aside. So if you're comfortable making a couple changes to that wording, or we want to leave it to Mr. Osmond to do so, I'm also comfortable with it. But I couldn't see the agreement go through in its current state without saying something.
Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just for clarification, are we still going to pass this tonight? And that would be a friendly amendment?
Yeah, I don't want to hurt the timeline.
Okay. Because I know they want to get going on this. So, okay, thank you.
Okay, are we clear here, Madam Clerk? Okay. All right, so motion by Councillor Peters with a friendly amendment to tweak the wording regarding procurement of and best practices for green initiatives. Seconder, Councillor Taylor. Any further questions or comments? No? All in favor? Okay, thank you. 10.4, this is note on 2018 surplus allocation that reports CPS TF 2019-22 dated August 12, 2019 regarding a 2018 surplus allocation be received, and the council approved the transfer of $1,356,325 to general reserves. Comments from council. Mr. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I asked this question ahead of time, so I don't think I'm being unfair to Ms. McKinney or Ms. Syed. But I guess my question would be, so what we've been told as council is that our reserve levels are at acceptable levels based on a town our size. So if that's the case, why would we put this to reserves when we're carrying an expense, and that is debt? So if our reserves are already at a good level, I would defer to putting it on debt, which would ultimately save the tax base monies. Now, given the interest rates are so low, it's not significant, but nonetheless, $1.3 million at 3 to 5% interest is significant in my mind. So I guess that would be my question: is why wouldn't we just put it against the debt? Thank you.
Right. I'm going to pass that off to Ms. Syed, but first, I think the intention was to place it in reserves until the budget process is sort of underway, and then perhaps see if that should be placed, whether on debt or in some other place. Mr. Taylor, I'm sorry. Let's go with Councillor Sherwood and then back to Councillor Taylor. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. Through you to our treasurer, I just want to clarify a question that I had addressed to you earlier, and that's in the background. The opening statement says the 2018 budget was approved by this council, and we did not approve the 2018 budget. So could you clarify that, please?
Ms. Syed.
Through Your Worship, to Councillor Sherwood, it is indeed a typo, so thank you very much for catching that. It should be 2019 budget.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say this is good news.
Right, let's go back to Councillor Taylor, sorry. Yes, thank you, Your Worship. So my question still stands to the treasurer. However, to answer yours, again, I would say it's a timing issue. If it makes no difference where it goes, then I would put the money where the expense is. And my financial background is rudimentary compared to what everybody else's would be, but I do deal with it on a regular basis, and that's how, by default, where we would go in business, put it where there's an expense, which is debt, not sitting and waiting. So, that's my question.
Madam Syed.
Through Your Worship, to Councillor Taylor. So first of all, just to give you a bit of a preamble, 2018 was a bit of an anomaly in the sense that the presentation of audit and budget kind of happens simultaneously. So it's fairly uncommon for council to deliberate on surplus simultaneously as they are looking at audit. So one of the reasons we have recommended to park, as the mayor has alluded earlier, to park this surplus in a general reserve so that when council is deliberating on 2020 budget, they will have an opportunity to look at the entire budget and see how this 2018 surplus can be allocated. Furthermore, as I'm coming up to my 3rd month of employment with the town, and I'm becoming more and more intimately familiar with our finances, I myself will also have an opportunity to look at our budget documentation, our financial priorities, and perhaps can bring a recommendation to this council as to where the 1.3 would be better allocated. Answering your question specific to the debt, it's once again, one of the things we have to look at holistically, not in a siloed way, is where does our debt level should be in terms of our asset management plan. We also have to look into reserve level. We have to look into our investment level. So it is too early for me to comment whether we are at the right debt capacity or reserve level capacity and so on. So really at this point in time, coming up to my 3rd month mark, my recommendation is to park that 2018 surplus in a general reserve and provide both the staff and council to, some time to review on 2020 budget and long-term financial needs and make a decision based on that.
Councillor Peters.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Ms. Syed. I believe a portion of this was the one-time provincial grant. So speaking to Councillor Taylor's conversation about where it could be applied, is there a very specific area that has to go to? I.e., if we put it into the reserves and then take it out for some expense that's not covered by that provincial governance, how do we account for that?
Through your worship, to Councillor Peters, my understanding of the one-time provincial grant is it's given to us to look into efficiency measure. So when we park a surplus allocation in a reserve account, it's earmarked, and that particular portion is already earmarked. So moving forward, we need to look closely into what some of those efficiency measures are. My understanding, again, I should preface that by saying my limited understanding of the grant is it's not meant for tax mitigation. It's explicitly meant for looking into future efficiency of service delivery.
Councillor Peters again.
Thanks, sorry, I'll just follow up and thank you for that answer. But I do want to touch on Councillor Taylor's concept about applying that to some of our current debt, and I do support that. I know we're spending $1 million at Harvey Curry Park, and obviously future efficiencies is not tied to recreation in this case, but there's some numbers here that could line up. So I'll look forward to the discussion when we're able to allocate that, but I do commend Councillor Taylor for looking at that financial management piece.
So, for the time being, the recommendation is to transfer to general reserves. Do we have a motion for that? Deputy Mayor McIntosh, seconded by Councillor Sherwood. Any further comment? We'll call the vote. All in favor? Okay, thank you. 10.5, we have an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment and a residential demolition permit application. This is regarding file numbers OPZ 119, RD 119, Regent Mercantile Bank Corp. Incorporated, care of Allen Young Planner Limited, 2 3rd Street. So, without reading all of this, which is significant, do we have a motion here to that? Deputy Mayor McIntosh, Councillor Taylor, any further discussion on this matter? I'll call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? Oh, okay. Thank you. 10.6. This is related to development charges and long-term care exemption. Recommendation that report CPS TF 2019, August 12th, regarding long-term care exemption be received, and the council provide direction to staff based on the graduated level of non-statutory DC exemptions for LTC as outlined in the report, Table 1. The council adopts the DC background study as amended, and the council has determined that no further public meeting is required in this regard. Any further comments on this? Okay, I had a further discussion this morning. I just wanted to, my feeling was that long-term care beds and rooms should be treated differently than a standard development charge for a residential unit, and I felt there should be a reduction. At this point, it appears that is not supported in this, so I just wanted to put that on the record. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I did follow up with staff on this as well because I wanted to make sure I understood the issue prior to voting on this. And the ultimate result in my mind is that these are businesses who make millions of dollars a year. We need more of them in our town for sure, but at the end of the day, I cannot support giving them any special treatment. If there is a need, then the buildings will be built, businesses will come, and if we give them special favor, there's only one other spot to go, and that's to the taxpayer. And I just don't want to do that at this time. So I recognize it, I've heard it, Orangeville, I know we need more long-term care facilities, but I will not be voting to give any kind of benefit on DC charges for their businesses.
Very good. Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe a portion of what Councillor Taylor's mentioned as well, they are businesses. At the same time, the need is there, and they've also gone through some, reorganizing at the ministry level. So in an effort to draw, we're competing in this case with other towns to bring these facilities here. So whether they get built or not, I don't think is in question, but whether they get built or not in Orangeville is the question, and they'll go where the best deal is. I don't want to give them a fantastic deal, but, I could see something to be exchanged almost. If we're looking at 50% here, $500,000, that's a big burden to make up in the taxes. So maybe we look at a different number, or maybe we look at that reduction being tied to some other performance level, be it at the community level or environmentally, or, I think this needs more discussion. The potential could be there to swap 25% of the DCs for some level of measure or improvement of the community or the environment, or both. So I'm not ready to vote on it just yet, but I think as we move towards, we're going to have fewer and fewer development proposals. Long-term care facilities are going to be quite large. They're going to have a large impact on the community. If we want them to be here and we want them to represent the values of the town, maybe there's a way to find that compromise.
All right. Well, this idea didn't come out of my brain. It was presented to me by an architect, and I'm talking specifically about long-term care facilities, and these are to be differentiated from operations like Montgomery Village, for instance, which is an independent living facility. Long-term care facilities are for those who can no longer care for themselves. These are for the seniors who can't care for themselves. The amount of money charged in a long-term care facility is fixed by the government, and the level of care is determined by the government. These are our most vulnerable people. These are our seniors that we should be taking care of and helping to age in place. Typically, they're living in rooms that are 200 square feet with a washroom. There's no kitchen facilities. They're not using our parks and recreation facilities. They're not using our roads. They're not using as much of our water and infrastructure. So, as it was presented to me, it sounded reasonable that on the, for lack of a better term, the rate card of development charges leading from single-family homes to semi to apartments, that there really should be one more line item, one more of, and I'm not talking about 50%, but some sort of way to incentivize and to say that our town cares and that we would like to see more long-term care beds. And I'm talking specifically about long-term care, not about private for significant profit, independent living seniors facilities, which don't necessarily need any kind of a break on this. So anyway, that's my comment on it. Staff is suggesting that these people need to be treated the same as anybody else. I vehemently disagree, but this is the report that's been given from staff, so. Anyway, Councillor Sherwood, over to you, sorry.
Yes, Your Worship, through you to Mrs. McKinney. Do you know if we did any comparison to other municipalities, if they offer any type of exemption or percentage exemption on these type of facilities? Oh, I'm sorry, you were the writer of the report, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Through your worship to Councillor Sherwood. So I have looked into, I mean, there's not too many reports available online, and I did not reach out to any municipalities directly. Some of the reports that I've seen, one that comes to my mind is City of Hamilton, and their recommendation was, well, it wasn't a recommendation per se, but they had very similar table and a similar graduated recommendation to council. So based on some of the reports that I've read, the recommendation to council was not to go the route of giving that exemption, because this is the effect of this exemption is to levy the delta from other sources, such as a taxation or user fees. So that is the limitation of my research. Like I said, I haven't reached out to anybody directly, but some of the reports that I have read, some of the reports did not give any direction from or recommendation from staff to council. Basically provided all the information to council and asked council to deliberate on it. One or two that has recommendation recommended against giving exemption.
Against, okay. Having had an aged parent who was put in a long-term facility and having to commute to see her made me very passionate on wanting to get something like this in town, and therefore I'm leaning more along the lines of wanting to give some type of exemption so that we can get our loved ones closer to home. But also, as you mentioned, Your Worship, the fees that these facilities charge are mandated, are governed by the government. They're controlled by the government.
Correct.
So if I don't know if there's any way of having one for a not-for-profit compared to for-profit. Like, I don't know if that's possible, but I am actually looking for giving some type of exemption, not 100%, and maybe, as Councillor Peters suggested, something just a little bit to maybe attract these type of facilities in our area.
Right, right. Yeah, I think the word exemptions, it's not correct, and it's probably some sort of reduced level of DC. Again, my argument is that those residents that live in those small rooms with limited access to, essentially these people are shut-ins, right? I mean, that's realistically what long-term care people are, and they're not utilizing our town services anywhere near the level of a typical resident. So, and that's really the crux of my argument. Councillor McIntosh, or Deputy Mayor, sorry.
Thank you. As somebody who's going to need one of these long before Councillor Taylor, I agree with the mayor. This is stiff competition to get these places here, and anything we can do to help that, I would support. Obviously not 50%, but if we can have a different, somewhat level, I'd certainly support that. Thank you.
I just want to ask a question. I know that there seemed to be some timeline here, Ms. Syed, on approval of the development charge bylaw. Can you tell us again what the timeline is on that?
August 26th, Your Worship.
August 26th, okay. So let's have Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Ms. Syed, just to follow up on the timelines, Is it possible that we approve it as written currently and could make an amendment in the future with respect to the specific issue, or is everything tied to the single document? Sorry, I'm seeing a lot of back and forth. Maybe it's the clerk.
Well, I can just help in terms of a timing perspective. They will need direction tonight on what that exemption amount is, because they have to amend the actual background study and have that information, and have a new bylaw prepared for you at your August 26th meeting, when you have to enact a new bylaw by.
Right.
Sorry, so just to be clear, and we can make no amendments to that after the August 26th deadline? Or is that just, you have to have something in writing by then, and perhaps we could address this in the future?
What happens is your current bylaw lapses. So in the absence of having a new bylaw in place, you're without a bylaw and unable to collect DCs.
Right,
So
sorry,
you
perhaps I
may-
didn't phrase it correctly. If we passed it as is with no exemption, for example, by the 26th, and we're able to do some homework and come to consensus in October, November next year, you know, is there an ability to make those amendments at a future date?
My understanding, and I'll look to the treasurer to correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that would involve doing an amendment to your background study, which is at a cost, because the consultant would have to do that amendment to then recalculate what the DCs are and then bring forward a new bylaw.
Through your worship, because this, just to the clerk's point, because this has an impact to the rate, the actual rate itself. So as the clerk mentioned, that we have to literally go back to the drawing board and recalculate and amend the new bylaw.
I'm going to ask Mr. Ward this question. Mr. Ward, do we have any long-term care facilities currently in planning?
To you, your worship, no current applications currently. We just went through a site plan approval process for the Phase 2 of Montgomery Village, received its approval and is now proceeding through building permit.
Is the second phase of Montgomery Village intended to be strictly long-term care?
Again, to your worship, it is. It's consistent with the existing facility that's there right now.
Well, the existing facility is independent living. It's not long-term care. There's a distinction there, right? I mean, long-term care is for the elderly who can no longer care for themselves. Montgomery Village is strictly an independent living facility where seniors live, and yeah.
I believe it is a range of care accommodation, from some independent living right on through to more of the assisted or long-term care type arrangements.
Right. So just, councillors, to be perfectly clear here, I'm only talking about long-term care. I'm not talking about the independent living type facility, which are typically profit-making. They do very well, and they're lovely. But this is not what I'm talking about, long-term care specifically. Councillor Sherwood.
Through you, your worship, I'm very passionate about this. I'm very much wanting to attract long-term care builders here. Much like we want to attract industrials and we provide them exemptions, there's reference in here that the foregone revenue would have to be funded at a source of taxation. Are we not already doing that with industrial exemptions? So why would this be any different? Like, what type of revenue losses are we talking here that it would be bared on the taxpayer?
Madam Treasurer.
Through your worship to Councillor Sherwood, so the actual revenue loss, if you look at the table that has been provided, so we have shown at 50% as well as 100%, so that gives you an idea. As I'm listening to council tonight, I actually am doing some calculation in real time, so if council is interested, I can tell you what the foregone revenue would be at 10%, 20, 30, and 40%. So that answers that question. I believe the first part of your question was in regards to industrial exemption. That I probably have to, you don't have that information? Okay.
We currently
Yes.
give exemption to industrial, correct? So I guess what I'm trying to say here is I'm also very much trying to advocate that we are that we are trying to promote and encourage long-term care facilities in here, and I would like them to be given the same opportunity as industry. I mean, industry is trying to make profit. These long-term cares, because I don't really believe they're for profit, but again, this is my passion.
And if I may, through your worship, to Councillor Sherwood again, the tone of this report is fairly neutral, because what staff is really trying to do is provide you with an example of what these exemption and foregone revenue would look like. By no means we are recommending one way or the other. So like I said, the tone of the report is fairly neutral in nature.
Thank you very much. I believe Mr. Brennan would like to jump in there and provide.
Mr. Brennan, sir.
Your Worship, through you, I just want to make a couple comments. One, we have to realize, and this is what we're trying to do to council, is for council to realize that if you give a break on the development charges for such organizations, we have to find that money somewhere else. So as our treasurer has identified, for a property of the size that's showing in our table, if you were given a 50% break on development charges, if we didn't know where to get the money from or what other source, it's really only the taxpayer that we have to go to look for money. So at $573,000, you will see, if you were to give this to a developer that came in today for one of our long-term care facilities, you would see an automatically increase of 1.6% on the tax levy, starting off with the budget, because that's, you have to find the money. We cannot take other DCs and shift the DCs around. And so we want to make sure the council understands that. Also, I just wanted to explain that with some of the changes that have been made in the Development Charges Act, they are sort of developer friendly. And one being the deferral of collection of DCs over a number of years instead of upfront. That is a great advantage to developers. And we haven't yet recognize how we would collect those differences in DCs over that period of time and how that payout over time would affect our bankroll. There's also, from the appraisal of the lands itself, that will change in the Development Charges Act that will be friendlier to our developers as well. Just as a conversations that we did have with one of our developers in town a number of years ago, we looked at the Midland scenario that they did, and actually they did not give a grant or a break in the development charges, but what they did allow was the collection of the development charges over 10 years, and that was something that was very welcomed by the developer of the day. And that was an item that we were looking for as well in our Development Charges Act as we go forward, or our Development Charges bylaw. So we just want to make sure that council realize that if we give the break and we come in and we're doing our budget presentations and you see an automatic 2% increase or a 3% or 4%, it is why. We have to find the money somewhere else. We just can't shake around or move around development charges from one to the other.
Right. Now, I just, again, want to reiterate what I said earlier. Development charges are to fund growth of the town, correct? Mr. Bannon, correct? So what I'm saying is the residents who are in a long-term care facility do not avail themselves as much as the rest of the residents on parks and recreation, on policing, on roads, on infrastructure. They just don't. So, you know, if this is a new facility and we're growing by this new facility, the need for additional infrastructure and other things of the town isn't there. So that's my argument. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with being, you know, forward-thinking or leading edge on certain things, and I think it would be great if we could have additional long-term care facilities in Southern Dufferin County or Orangeville, and that's my pitch, folks. So, okay, we've got three other councillors that want to weigh in here. So, Councillor Peters, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Two quick questions for Mr. Ward, if you don't mind. The first is, can you confirm we redo the DC bylaw every 5 years? Is that right?
Through your worship to Councillor Peters, yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, before you turn your mic off. In the case of a mixed care development, for example, X beds of retirement community versus X beds of long-term care, would the development charges be weighted under that same formula? For example, if you have a retirement home, 100,000 square feet of retirement home and 100,000 square feet of long-term care, if we pulled this section out, would the calculation be such that the two portions of the development would be calculated at separate rates?
Mr. Ward.
Through you, your worship, I perhaps might defer to our treasurer as to how that might be calculated. I believe it is with respect to number of units, with respect to long-term care.
Sure.
However, again, I might defer on the long-term care component.
But if we talk about a typical residential development where there might be single-family, semi-detached apartments in the same development, they're addressed differently. That's what I'm suggesting here, is that they be addressed differently. It's just another line on the rate card, that's all I'm saying, so. And I'm not suggesting 50% either. My thoughts would be maybe 20% reduction, but I think it's significant enough to attract attention, and it's not enough to create financial hardship for us. Yes, Madam Syed, Ms. Syed.
To your worship, if you're interested what it would look like at 20%, like I said, I was doing some real-time calculation. So at 20%, we're looking at $229,000, and that would, using the variables that I've used on my report, and with that, we are looking at a 0.64% tax rate impact.
Right. Okay.
So I could finish.
If a long-term care facility was even approved, right? Okay.
Yeah. So and
which we haven't got any yet.
This is kind of where I was going to go. Is that
Yes,
you know we may see one of these developments in the next 5 years or zero. So I guess to get a vote started, I'd propose a very safe number at 10%, which I believe would be a fifth. So it's in the neighborhood of $100,000 on. This would be a very large development, by the way. 130,000 square feet. That's several stories worth. So I suppose I'll move 10% to see where it lands and move the conversation along. But again, in 5 years, we're going to be looking at the subject again. And if by then we decided it was a terrible idea or it needs to be amended or moved one way or another, obviously the council of the day can make that call as well.
Okay, let's go to Councillor Post.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. My question goes to, I'm not sure if it's going to be Ms. Syed or if it's Mr. Brennan. Based on some of the comments that were made about the amount of money that would need to be sourced if we started adding exemptions in, and my thought process is very much aligned with yours, Mr. Mayor, is that my understanding of development charges is that they're used to fund growth and to fund extras that are needed as a result of the development. So when we're talking about a tax rate impact and having to make up $573,000 on a tax rate at a 50% exemption, I'm not sure that that's realistic when we're talking about what are you thinking that you're going to need the money for if we're not using it for an increase in service? I think that Mr. Mayor is exactly correct when he says that when we're talking about a long-term care facility, these are not people who are using our amenities in the same way as a single-family home or a townhome would be. So perhaps, I don't know if that covered my question. You look confused at me, but when we're talking about that tax rate impact, I'm not sure if that's a genuine number if we're looking at it that way, if that number is realistic.
So through your
Madam
worship,
Treasurer, yeah.
to Councillor Post, and I'll try to answer at least the first half of that question, and then I'll defer to our CAO. So the numbers presented, and I already put the caveat in on the report, that this is just for, to give you an idea what it may look like, and some of the variables I've used current DC rates, not the proposed DC rates. I've used a fictitious, long-term care facilities of 12,000 square foot. It could be 130,000, and there are other variables that may come into play that I haven't factored in. So this is a very simplistic way of giving you an idea of what the tax rate or impact would look like. Also, I used 2019 budgetary impact here. So having said all of that, I think it's a more philosophical discussion that's happening here. The report was intended to give you a point of reference. It's not be all and end all. It's just to trigger a discussion, in which, by the sounds of it, we have triggered a discussion today. So I think that would be the extent of my answer to your question, and I'm hoping that our CAO may have something more to add.
Mr. Brennan.
Your Worship, I will try. Normally, our DC plans are for a 5-year plan projection. So within that 5 years, we are projecting what we require. This time around for development charges, we used to have hard and soft services, i.e. the recreation, and then some of the hard or core services such as police, fire, roads, water distribution, those types of things. So as you may recall from our presentation from our consultant, a lot of our soft services are now going to be moved to the Planning Act, into the Community Benefits Fund, or I forget the exact name. We don't know really yet how much money we can collect from our from that new regulations that's going to come out, but we do know at this stage that in our 5-year plan, with the projected growth that we have, this is the amount of dollars that we will need, and this, from the Development Charges Act, this is the amount of money that we are allowed to collect. So if we're saying that we're going to give a developer a break, what the Act is saying is that we cannot collect development charges on that or charge, put those development charges to someone else. What we have to do is find another means to pay for that money or pay for those breaks. So if we give, let's give an example, a $356,000 break to a developer coming in reality, the only thing that we have to raise that other money is tax rates or tax levy, unless we want to look at imposing new fees or increasing rates and fees to something else to offset that money. But it'll be a new money that we have to find to pay for that reduction that you're giving the developer for such development.
Okay, Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, Your Worship. Just to kind of further Councillor Peters' recommendation for a 10%, if that motion is on the table and fails, I'll be tabling a motion for 20%. I think that is fair enough to, and again, I'm trying to attract those types of businesses. I'd also like it in the recommendation that 20% be specifically for long-term care and not retirement homes. And that, where was I going with it? Again, because we would be taxing, or we offer no development charges to the industrial properties that we're trying to attract, we in turn would be asking the taxpayers to make up for that, and to me, they would be demanding more of our services than long-term care. So again, if Councillor Peters' motion, I believe, is on the table for 10%.
Nobody seconded it yet.
Okay, so then
Would anybody like to second it or let it die?
Was somebody going, are we going to go back to that? Because if not, then I'd like to put in 20% and make it very specific to long-term care.
I just wanted to, I just pulled up last council agenda. I'm looking at the Watson Development Charge Report, and in this table 2.1, which is on, I don't know what page this is, hang on, it's page 34 of the agenda. So, like I said, I mentioned the term rate card. So we've got single and semi-detached dwellings, development charge of $25,259. Apartments, 2 bedrooms, $13,808. Apartments, bachelor, 1 bedroom, $8,651. So my argument is, we're going from 25,000 to 13,000 to 8,651, and everybody's saying, great, that's fine. I'm saying there's another level here to go down. There's another level of type of resident in our town that does not avail themselves of all of our. So why do we go from 25,000 to 8,651 on a type of residential development? But people are pushing back on my suggestion of a reduced rate for long-term care. I think it's clear that the development charge consultant is accepting that different sizes of residences have reduced requirements for development charges, and I believe that there's one more step to take. So, we have not received a seconder, or have we? Councillor Taylor, do you want to carry on? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. So, to me, when you are in any type of business arrangement, there is always a bunch of different variables, and you play those variables out in your poker hand as you go along. Money is consistently one of them, for sure. But I would suggest, in this instance, money isn't the piece. People will come to this town for long-term care. There's a shortage, for sure. There'll be a business plan that makes absolute sense. And this council and the taxpayers of this town do not need to fund that. They will come. They will come. So we do not need to do this. we're offering money as an incentive that is just not necessary to do. So I feel like this is a bad spend of money. I really appreciate Mr. Brennan's explanation. If we do fund it, it has to come from somewhere, and that means it comes from the taxpayer. And I've still got Stockholm Syndrome from walking around knocking on doors last year, and everybody was upset about taxes. This is, in my view, not a good idea. We don't
Councillor
need to go down
Peters,
this road.
You're suggesting that the long-term care resident uses the same amount of development charges as a typical one-bedroom apartment dweller does.
I'm suggesting that a large corporation or a privileged builder is going to come in and profit from us when they do not. We don't need to do that with them.
Fair enough. Now, we had a motion on the floor for passing this development charge bylaw with a 10% reduction to development charges. The other issue, and has this been dealt with at all, Mr. Brennan, in terms of this development charge bylaw, in terms of deferral of development charges, or is this going to be a provincially mandated issue?
Your Worship, a couple of things. This will be provincially mandated, so we will not have a say in that. It's the province that will have it. And just to clarify, just another example, our treasurer just put together some numbers. So if we were looking at a larger facility, 130,000 square feet, at 10%, you would be looking at a $1.25 million. So again, working with hard percentages, the larger your facility is going to be.
On what exemption level was that?
10%, Your Worship.
Right. Okay. Well, 130,000, I don't know that that's ever going to happen. But anyway, Councillor Peters.
Sorry, I don't mean to debate the math, but the table that was put together was for 12,000 square meters. So that table already reflected 130,000 square feet. So I don't think there should be any changes to that value. Unless I'm mistaken, but I believe that was 12,000 square meter was the base table amount. The units aren't shown, but then the next line shows dollars per square meter, so I assumed it was square meters.
Right.
So I just want to clarify.
Okay. So again, let's just to recap this. We have a motion on the floor for 10% reduction, passing the development bylaw, development charges bylaw with a 10% reduction for long-term care. Was there a seconder for that? Seeing none. Do we have another motion on the floor? Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, Your Worship. So my motion is for 20%, making it specific to long-term care only. Long-term
I would
care
second that.
Thank you.
Any further comments on that motion? I will call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? That motion passes. Thank you. Okay, moving on. 10.7, 2020 budget schedule and direction. Recommendation that report CPS TF 2019-20 dated August 2019 be received and the council endorses receiving a 5-year budget outlook for operating budget and a 10-year budget outlook for capital budget deliberations, and the council approve the inclusion of a cost of living allowance equivalent to the CPI as of May 2019 as a guideline to report a budget for non-union staff salary and benefits in the proposed 2020 budget in line with past direction from council, and that staff be directed to include an incremental increase to the tax levy contribution of the capital budget of $178,000 or 0.5% of the prior year's levy in the proposed 2020 budget, and further contributions of prior year's levy in the next 9 subsequent years as outlined in Table 1. The staff be directed to include an incremental increase to the contribution to the general capital reserve of $178,000 or 0.5% of the prior year's levy in proposed 2020 budget, and further contributions of prior year's levy in the next 9 subsequent years as outlined in Table 2. Okay, Councillor Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I am the cheapy councillor this evening, so I guess I'd like to speak to the first part, which is the cost of living allowance. I have no issue with that. I think it's very appropriate that we would do that. However, when it comes to the capital budget and the operating budget at the 0.5%, it feels It feels like I don't have enough information to be able to make that prognostication tonight. I'm uncomfortable with a 0.5% increase to the tax levy on both of those items. And so I just, at this point, I won't be supporting the bottom portion of 10.7. However, I would support the cost of living portion.
Okay, any further comments from councilors? Councilor Sherwood?
Yes, Your Worship. I want to reiterate what Councillor Taylor has said there. I too am not comfortable with approving the capital budget by 0.5 and as well as the general capital reserve. I think this is something we could discuss when we get to budget deliberations. And next, I'm also wondering about the 10-year outlook of the capital budget. I believe when we did the capital budget, and we did 5-year, Mr. Brennan. So why the change to 10-year? Because that's a long time away.
Mr. Brennan?
Or the treasurer.
Okay, Ms. Syed.
Through your worship to Councillor Sherwood. So the 10-year outlook is now mandated by the provincial government under Ontario Regulation 588/17, and I may have alluded to that on the background of this report. So it's now provincially mandated.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know how we want to deal with this going forward, but I'm supportive of Councillor Taylor's thought process there. I'm not really comfortable with that part of the recommendation.
Councillor Peters?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Madam Treasurer. The two tables, while we're talking about the reserve contributions, could you clarify, it wasn't entirely clear to me, is this meant to represent the total percentage of tax levy or the increase to the reserves based on the previous year's tax levy? So when we're talking 0.5%, is that 0.5% total contribution as it was in 2019, or is that a 0.5% increase on the 0.5% we already did in 2019?
Ms. Syed, sorry.
Through your worship to Councillor Peters, it's the latter. So it's incremental increase of previous year's contributions. So in 2019, whatever we have contributed, so 2020 contribution is 0.5% of that. So it's incremental.
Okay, so, sorry, I just want to beat this to death for a second. So that's a 0.5% on, let's just say it was 1%. So that would be, then be 1.05, or we're adding the full 0.5%? Sorry, it looks like
Mr. Brennan.
Mr. Brennan would like to.
Your Worship, maybe to provide some clarity on this, past councils brought in a 1% increase on capital reserves and 1% increase on capital projects a number of years ago. It was identified that our infrastructure gap was too wide, so in a move to trying to close that gap and trying to get the money to do our infrastructure, some of our capital projects, each year we put 1% to capital reserves and 1% to capital projects, and that was the 1% of your previous year's tax levy. Last year, if you remember, we reduced that from a 1% and a 1% to a 0.5 and a 0.5 percentage of the tax levy. What we're recommending this year is to leave it at the 0.5. Over the last number of years, it was an accumulation each year that 1% and the 1% would form part of your base budget. So coming forward, we're reducing it by 50%. Instead of going 1% and 1% in the cumulative years, we're going 0.5. What we're recommending is 0.5 and 0.5. Now, with that said, what we're asking council is we can use that as a guideline. Once we get into budget deliberations, if you feel that is too much money and it's having too much impact on our tax levy, considering where we need to go with our capital tangible assets and our capital assets and what we need to spend to keep our roads, to keep our water, to keep our facilities in good repair, I would say at that stage, council will probably be at a better position to say reduce it or increase it.
Okay, thanks. So then we're talking 0.5% in 2021, 22, and then moving up to 0.75 in subsequent years, and then 1 and then 1.5 as a total base contribution to the reserves.
Through your worship, that is correct. And what we're saying here is really there's been a lot of changes with the new government coming in, Bill 108. We don't know, like I say, coming in the future, we do not know if we will have OCIF funding. It may be a grant application. That may be a $800,000 hit to the municipality each year that we've relied on over the last number of years to get capital projects done. So we may see ourselves down the road with that 1% and 1% or 2% really only keeping us par where we were a number of years ago with investment into our capital infrastructure.
Okay, thanks. So the last, I guess, direction I'll head here, it must be getting late because I'm agreeing with Councillor Taylor, but I think for the purpose of us to look at the 10-year plan now, at least for me personally, I think the best way to view those trends and what the up and downs may look like would be to flatline this number for those 10 years to see where we may have peaks and valleys against our projected capital outlook. Again, we're going to discuss this again all during the budget deliberations, but as a starting point, if, for example, we made that 1% all the way across those 10 years, you know, I think we could pinpoint those expenditures and outlays that we'll have over that course of time without having to do the math twice. Oh, we went up in reserves, but we're going, you know, we have a larger capital expenditure. It may be harder to pick out those items, and I think the analysis might be easier if the baseline budget was set up with a flat-lined contribution. And I don't know if that aligns with what Councillor Taylor was thinking in terms of not putting the increases in the base budget. I'm not trying to make it complicated, but I agree. If we're getting all the way up to the 1.5, you know, I'd like to think we don't have to get there, but obviously if we do, we do, and we'll see what happens when the budget comes.
Deputy Mayor McIntosh.
Thank you, Worship. I'll keep this brief. My question was actually answered by Mr. Brennan. This is just basically a guideline. This doesn't mean anything. It's just something that staff is going to start on, and we will get to juggle the figures as we see fit. So really, we're not approving anything. This is just a guideline. Thank you.
Correct. Okay, Councillor Taylor.
I appreciate that. Thank you to the treasurer for explaining it. I fully understand where you're going, and Deputy Mayor, I appreciate your sentiment. It's still, in my mind, it's not a good idea to approve this and allow citizens to think that that's what we're going to do. I don't want to cause any angst. I've always thought it was, and to be just really blunt, I thought it was complete BS whenever I've seen any kind of budget, and then we know they're going to cut it. Let's not participate in that. Let's just kind of put out what we think it's going to be now, and not play the game. Let's just go forward. So I won't be voting to put the 0.5 in.
Okay. So we any other further comments? Okay. So I guess we need a motion here. Anybody prepared to make a motion? Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Okay. Deputy Mayor McIntosh has made a motion to accept as written. Do I have a seconder? I'll second. Call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? Do we have another motion? Are you gonna make a motion? Go ahead. You've got something brilliant. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There you go.
I won't say it's brilliant. I suppose the easiest way would be to make the original motion for all matters except for the reserves. And then I would go back to my original discussion point, which is to flatline it, and whether that's at the current 0.5% or at a slightly more conservative 1%. But then we don't have the escalation factors and the perhaps gamesmanship of starting high and coming down low. So I you know, ask Councillor Taylor whichever one he's comfortable with, but I think flatlining gives us a better understanding of, you know, if we're able to keep things the same over those 10 years, that would be the ideal circumstance, and we'll worry about escalation when we have to get there, understanding that we obviously have to think ahead with reserves, but so I would suggest splitting the motion if it's not too much trouble, and then having the reserves piece done separately.
Okay, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Mayor, if I may suggest that you separate the vote and take perhaps a vote on the first three recommendations, because I do believe that I heard that there was concurrence with respect to those three recommendations. So if you separate the vote and take the vote on that first, and then you could deal with the last two separately, that would be my suggestion.
Okay. All right, so we have a motion then that the report be received and the council endorse a 5-year budget outlook and a 10-year budget outlook for capital budget deliberations. The council approve inclusions of a cost of living allowance equivalent to CPI. And that separates out the last two items in that motion. May I have a seconder for that? Councillor Sherwood. We'll call the vote. All in favor? Okay. Now, do we want to address the second portion of this? Councillor Taylor.
Through your worship to Councillor Peters, I guess I'm a little confused on the flatlining, please, because if you were going to truly flatline, you would move away from a percentage-based and you would have a flatline dollar amount. So, you know, for round figures, say it was 125,000 or something like that. But so everybody understands, the tax levy will continue to grow, but the percentage amount, it would no longer be 0.5. The following year, it could be 0.4. 10 years from now, it might be 0.2, that sort of thing. So if that's what you meant, then I'd be supportive of something like that.
Councillor Peters.
I was just keeping the percentage metric as that was the way it was presented, and it could account for inflation purposes over time. It's always going to be expressed, I think, as a percent, because we don't know what dollar amount to put in the reserves against specific projects necessarily. We know that we'd like, say, 1% support, backup, contingency, reserve, whatever you want to call it. So I don't think we're going to get away from the percentage metric, and I'm sure the treasurer would like us to keep it in familiar terms. So whatever that number is, it looks like we're getting to 0.75 in the coming years. Maybe that's the number, and we just say, let's use 0.75 across the board for the next 9 years, and obviously it's going to...
Sorry. Councillor Taylor? Sorry, Councillor Peters. Sorry, sorry.
So I have a suggestion, and maybe it's a motion, but I would actually suggest that we defer this. And why I would suggest that we defer it, and we could, by deferral, to next meeting, and I have spoken with the treasurer via email over my concerns, and my concern is I don't feel educated enough on debt levels and reserves versus where we should be versus other municipalities versus, to Mr. Brennan's point about our capital projects and whatnot. So net, like, you're always trying to ground a number in something. So, hey, I make $31 million a year. Well, congratulations, everybody else makes $40 million a year. So you're actually behind the times. Like, you need to know if it's good or not. So I guess if I could understand, are we good or not, and have a better reference for what that is, then I might feel more comfortable in knowing what our needs are and be able to go forward. And I appreciate it's the third month in the job, but it's just difficult to make a decision like that unless you have the background and can ground the number in something.
Is your motion to table the last two items?
My motion would be to push these last two items on the capital and the operating to next meeting based on the information coming forward from the treasurer about what other like municipalities are in terms of their reserve levels and their capital projects, and give us something to ground this in. Like, do we need this or do we not? Because if we don't need it, then we're going to pull. If we do, then, gosh, clearly we'll vote for it, right? But I don't know.
Okay. Councillor Sherwood.
Yes, Your Worship, I would be supporting Councillor Taylor's recommendation there. I think I would like to see staff come back with a report to give us some more meat and potatoes as to the reasonings behind this, and maybe give us some more clarity on what would be the benefits of that scenario, because I'm tending to be more in line with where Council Peters is going, but I think we still need a little bit more information here to make an absolute decision.
So we have a motion to refer this back to staff, to report back to us at our next council meeting. Mr. Brennan.
Your Worship, I don't want to be putting a downer on this, but our treasurer will not be ready in a couple of weeks to make recommendations to council. We will be ready when we come to the planning stage or presenting our budget. And to be certain, and just to clarify, these are only guidelines for us to come in and start planning. You know, over the last number of years, we've always worked with the 1% and 1%. We have reduced it last year to 0.5% and 0.5%. What we are recommending from a staff perspective, based on our assets and what we've done historically in the last number of years, is to leave it at least to 0.5 and 0.5. However, if council doesn't want us to include that in our first attempt and first presentations to council, if you want us to come in at a 0% for both capital and capital reserves, we can do that as well. And what we will do then is show that we have to find money somewhere if you want to do the same type of, or the same level of projects, or the same expenditure. So in reality, this is truly just planning so that we have numbers and we know what we can work on to make our first presentation to council. And council would have all the opportunities at that stage to say, I'm sorry, we're not going with that 0.5 and that 0.5, we're moving it down. On the flip side, you may say, we need to move this up to the 1% and the 1% again to address some of these capital projects that we want to move in our term of council.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mr. Brennan, for explaining that. I'm fully on board, and I apologize for being difficult. My suggestion would be is then that we instruct staff through yourself, Mr. Brennan, to come back with 0 for operating and capital. And my suggestion would be is the projects that we cannot fit into our budget, which I understand this will create angst, goes on to a separate page or table. We understand what those projects are worth. You know, perhaps they're ranked by staff in terms of level of need, and then council will have a discussion and a debate with where that is. But again, I'm just very sensitive to where we are. I heard there is an article out now where we fell to 9th in the province for most expensive taxes to be in, and I just, you know, hey, great. But we just need to be very sensitive, and so that's why I'm pushing so hard.
So you're making a motion then that we stick with 0% and not 0.5%, correct? Is there a seconder for that? Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Any further comment? Call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? That motion passes. So staff has been directed to go back with 0. Yes, we're going to have a 5-minute recess. Madam Clerk.
Just for request that Councillor Taylor withdraw his motion regarding the deferral.
Regarding?
The deferral request, because it was on the floor.
Go ahead. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I will do that. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have a 5-minute break, folks. We'll be back We're on to item 11.1. This is a recommendation that minutes of the following meeting be received. The Heritage Orangeville meeting of May 15th, 2019. May I have a motion to receive these minutes? Councillor Sherwood, second by Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Any comments on that? No? All in favor? Thank you. Item 12, question period. Are there anybody from the audience would like to have a question? Mr. Gristo.
Council, good evening. The reason I'm here tonight, it's something that is on 15.1 of your agenda, relate to the rail discussion tonight and a motion that it's coming down. I have several, and it's dear to my heart because I was a member of the council those days when we purchased the rail, which only cost $3.5 million at the time, and $2 million came from the province, $750 came from the town, and $750 came from the county, which it was a great deal. Otherwise, we would never had the rail here, and we probably wouldn't have had many industries in our town. Even so, that some are probably left, but there is 6 of them that they still use. You got 4 in the town of Orangeville, and 2 is my understanding in Peel, that they still use the rail. So
Yes, sir. What is your question, Mr. Gristo? Your question,
my question will be to this council, where those 6 industry advise of this motion tonight? And the other question I have, would there be public meetings if council decided to sell it? And those are the 2 questions.
Okay. We had meetings with the Orangeville-Brampton Railway Access Group, Mr. Gristo. We've had a couple of meetings. They're aware of our concern of the roughly $450,000 losses that this rail line has incurred. They're also aware of our concern for the liability of running a railroad and the concern of 42 bridges between here and Streetsville, and they're also aware of our concern for the $10 million in collective losses that this railway has brought upon the shoulders of the residents of Orangeville. So we're not taking this lightly. We're going to ask staff to investigate what the options are, but we feel it's necessary to take action that previous councils haven't taken. As far as the existing businesses, we believe that there are options for them in terms of receiving their rail goods. Where I'm sure there will be public meetings regarding this, and we welcome input from those businesses. And we welcome input from residents as well. Councillor Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Mr. Gristo. Thank you for your question, Mr. Gristo. The railway situation, to me, is just an obligation on council to look into the facts. Nothing is being put into any kind of decision at this time. It's just merely, let's explore and see, and absolutely happy to meet with you, happy to meet with the businesses. All of this council will be very interested in hearing from the residents on this situation, but there is no decision here. It's just, the decision is to look into what possibilities could be. That's it.
Because I did receive a phone call from one of the industries, which employs 130 people in this town. Now, you, Mr. Mayor, you claim the $10 million.
Yes.
You fail to recognize the benefits. How much of these industries they pay in taxes? How many jobs they've been created? That they're spending money in our town. And those people that are working in those industries, they also probably live in town too, which they pay taxes to the town. I think you fail to recognize those. So I want to point that out.
We're absolutely, completely well aware of all of those facts, Mr. Gristo.
Or because I was advised by this industry that gave me a call to come and express my opinion. I was told 4 years ago that the town should thank me for fighting for this rail. Because if it wasn't for the rail, they would have been gone. I don't
Right,
want to
and we-
mention, I don't want
well,
to mention you the name of the industry.
There's two sides to that
I'm sure
argument.
you'll be the one that you can find out.
Yeah, two sides to that argument, Mr. Gristo. I'm going to let Councillor Sherwood have a comment. Go ahead, sir.
Your worship, through you to Mr. Gristo, in answer to one of your questions on how much taxes they've been paid, I've actually asked this information upon our treasurer. And in 2019, we collected from the 4 businesses $196,000 in taxes. However, we paid in taxes $342,000. So all of our taxpayers have subsidized by $146,000. And in other words, those 4 industries that provide us $196,000 didn't even cover the cost of what those taxes were for them. And I also want to bring your attention, we have got 0 tax dollars from those 2 industries in Brampton. So we're actually subsidizing them and getting nothing from them. So the 4 businesses aren't, in my opinion, how I'm visually looking at it is, they're not contributing to our infrastructure and our operations. They're not even covering the cost of what we paid in taxes. Doesn't mean I made the decision that I want to sell, but these are facts that should be taken in consideration, and that was in answer to your question.
Your worship, I understand that you say that maybe they don't pay anything, those 2 industries in Peel. Let me remind you, they do pay something. You know what? Because they maintain the rail line. The only thing the town pays is the $350,000 in taxes for the land. Because we couldn't, for the sake of me, even myself, we couldn't get the province to agree to do away with it, which Caledon is one, Peel is the other one, and Mississauga is the other one. But let me give you something in return here. Maybe you should explore you should explore with Caledon, partner. You should explore with Peel, partnership. And I don't know if Mississauga will be inclined into this. So my take into this.
Okay, Mr. Gristo,
Well,
you're given 3 minutes. You're about 10 minutes in here. So I'm afraid we're at an end for tonight. Thank you very much for your concern about the rail line. I would suggest you put your issues in writing or meet with any of the councillors, but tonight we've had enough. Thank you, sir.
Let me remind you of something. I stood here many times, sir. There were other people here on a question period. You never once mentioned the 3 minutes. Every time I come here to speak to you guys, there is the 3 minutes. You
Mr.
have
Gristo,
yourself a nice night.
yeah, thank you. We're now on to correspondence, 13.1. We have correspondence from our MPP Sylvia Jones regarding restoration of the interlibrary loan program service. We also have 13.2, which is correspondence from Allison Shield, the Orangeville BIA General Manager, asking for asking for support on a number of their issues. And we also have a letter from Mr. David Kirk talking about council's response to and support of the water amnesty program, his letter support of that. May I have a motion to accept all of those correspondence, or is there, Councillor Sherwood wishes to speak to that. Go right ahead.
Yes, Your Worship. I just wanted to bring to council attention that the General Manager, Allison, is here. If you had any questions or concerns, she did provide us with great documentations about a lot of initiatives and incentives that are happening in downtown BIA, but she is here to answer any questions if council so wishes.
Any council members? Any questions that anybody wishes to ask? Okay. Yeah, I'm certainly supportive of BIA's initiatives and their wish to report back to council from time to time. We did talk about having the BIA provide more detailed reporting on their budget, and I hope to see that in the future. But that's all I have to say for now. Allison, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you for your report. So we have a motion, seconded by, motion by Mr. Peters, seconded by Ms. Post, Councillor Post. All in favor? Thank you. All right, now we have 14.1, information items, 14.1 through 14.4. May I have a motion? Oh, okay, Councillor Peters wishes to speak to one of these items.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, just briefly, 14.3 regarding the speed reduction on here Ontario Street. The recommendation has come from the town of Mono, who we share that street with. As some people may know, it's sort of a north half, south half kind of deal, or east-west in this case. They're looking for support to move that speed limit down to 40 kilometers per hour. This street is purely residential and leads into Island Lake. I see no reason for, the current speed limit. I see no downside to the reduction, I suppose is a better way to say it. So I'd like to make a separate motion besides receiving the information items to support the speed reduction to 40.
Okay. Do we have a seconder for that? Deputy Mayor McIntosh. So shall we vote on that right now? All in favor? Okay, so that was a vote to not only support the town of Mono's motion, but also to make a motion on behalf of town council to support the 40-kilometer reduction, right? Okay. Councillor Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I did speak to residents on Buena Vista as well, and they were all very in favor of that as well. So thank you, Councillor Peters, for making that motion. My question is to our treasurer again, and I'm sorry to keep going to the same spot. But on 14.2, first of all, congratulations to town staff. We're ahead of budget, which is phenomenal at this point. The way I read the report, and again, my limited understanding of things, but point 1 and point 3 of this, which is the 970,000, the 470,000, the way I read the report is that they're expected to grow and remain to year end. So to me, if we were to do that, it's about $1.4 million. Would we not take this to our debt or to the capital reserves now? And then reevaluate again at Q2 and potentially take more money to profit now, or profit, sorry, business speak, but to reserves or to debt, and enjoy that now instead of waiting if we know it's going to continue to be ongoing?
Pardon me. Yes, Treasurer, I'm sorry.
Through your worship to Councillor Taylor. So point 1 and 3, so let me speak to point 1 first. 2017 operating surplus has already been applied to general capital deficit loan. Given that, and as I've already mentioned earlier today, 2018 audit was an anomaly given that it was done so late in the year. So some of these entries are happening in 2019. So council has already approved to apply 2017 operating surplus to various loan or debt level. In terms of compensation, gapping, and deficiencies of $473,000, that's as has been alluded in the report, that is due to some of the vacancies that happened throughout the organization. To Councillor Taylor, once again, this is just the first quarter variance analysis. I am hoping to bring the second quarter in September. As we are coming to full complement of staff in Treasury, some of these reports will come to you in a more timely fashion. So I would caution council or suggest to council that as we get through our second and third quarter variance, and as you see a better picture of where the surplus or deficit position is, perhaps it would be a better time to make some of those decisions or some of the suggestions that you're making. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Councillor Sherwood.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Taylor beat me in the queue because I'm actually going to go back to 14.3, and I know we voted on it about the speed, but I wanted to make a comment on behalf of our Councillor Andrews, that he was in support of a 40-kilometer and that he's noted the speeding on that as being a regular concern, and he would like to see drivers slow down, so he would also be supporting 40%.
Very good. Very good. 40 kilometers, right. Okay. Councillor Post.
And I think now is an appropriate time for me to go to your report, Mr. Mayor, 14.4, regarding Jurassic Park. And I just wanted to highlight to those who are listening that it was just a little bit of a highlight as to all the donors who helped to fund this. It was a very positive experience. We received really great comment from the community about what a great inclusive event it was and how much fun it was. So I don't know if now is the appropriate time, but perhaps, and Mr. Osmond might be the right person to direct it to, as we're heading into the budget process, perhaps it would be appropriate for us to allocate $10,000 or $15,000 towards community events of this sort, if there's not already that line item. I know we held special council meetings to make Jurassic Park specifically happen, but we received such great feedback that I would love to see us not have to scramble and hunt for that money when it comes for when an opportunity like this comes forward again. So perhaps Mr. Osmond's the right person.
Mr. Osmond.
To you, Your Worship, to Councillor Post, I think I'm the right person. When it comes to events, I'm all about it. But what I'd like to do is I would definitely take it under advisement, take it back to our budget process, and I'll include it, and we can confer over it when we get back to the budget deliberations. But yes, it's great. It was a great event and a great community event. And we're doing events, but it'd be a good question on how we go from here. So again, from a tourism perspective as well. So I will bring it back in our budget. We're in our budget now, all over it. So it'd be great timing. So we'll bring it back and have a look at it.
Okay. So I think we voted on 14.3 in terms of accepting that. So now we need a motion on 14.1, 2, and 4, accepting or recommendations and information listed be received. Councillor Post, seconded by Councillor Sherwood. All in favor? Thank you. Okay, now on to 15.1, notice of motion given prior to the meeting. Councillor Taylor, consideration of sale or other disposition in whole or in part of Orangeville Railway Development Corporation. Councillor Taylor, do you have anything further to say on this item? There you go.
Your Worship, would you like me to read this, or do we just? It's such a long piece. I could speak to it, perhaps. Maybe that might help.
Maybe you could speak to it and
when
the background.
Thank you, Your Worship. When Mr. Gristo was here, he made reference to this, and maybe a little bit of background for the public, and that is that this council, everyone sits on the Orangeville Railway Development Corporation. That's a tongue twister. And in that meeting, we have reviewed the financials and started to debate about what the long-term ramifications on the town would be is if we did not have the railway. In those discussions, none of us said definitively what we would do. We didn't say that we would sell it. We didn't say that we would continue it. There was nothing along those lines. This motion is merely to investigate further what next steps would be. And I think you'll find that council is doing that in a lot of these initiatives. So recreation, our police department, this situation. So in none of those situations would anybody on this council stand up and say what we should do. We don't have the facts just yet in those situations, and that's what this motion is about, is to look into the facts of what the railway could be to the town moving forward. So it was my motion. However, it was my motion only because we came out of council and everybody took a step back and I wasn't paying attention, and I got stuck making the motion. So it could have been any of us up here that made this motion, and I just wanted to, I guess we were unified in putting this forward. So we'll find out what the facts are, and we'll go from there. Is that good
Great.
enough?
I think that's a good recap, yeah. So this is Councillor Taylor's motion. Do we have a seconder for this? Deputy Mayor McIntosh. Any further discussion tonight? All in favor? Thank you. Okay, 16, notice of motion at meeting. So I had circulated some information earlier today about a meeting that I had with Dufferin Board of Trade. There's been a request from Dufferin Board of Trade to assist with a rural economic development grant to further achieve the goals of the Trades in Dufferin project. This project will add an employer apprentice matching component to the Trades in Dufferin web portal, also enable the creation of an annual skilled trades night event promoting local careers and skilled trades to students and parents, and second career seekers. It also will provide funding for advertising and promotion of both the website and the event. This is a multi-year grant allowing for an event in the spring of 2020 and 2021 and advertising throughout both years. The likelihood of approval of a rural economic development grant, this is through the provincial government, increases by having co-applicants. Dufferin Board of Trade has requested the town of Orangeville become a co-applicant for the event and provide $3,000 cash and $2,000 in kind through space rental and promotion, financial contribution per year for 2 years, 2020 and 2021. So the motion is to provide $5,000 in each of 2020 and 2021 in support of DBOT's application. That money would only occur if the matching funds grant was approved by the provincial government. Councillor Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I assume you're asking for this to be a motion this evening?
Yeah, well, no,
Or is this a
I think
notice?
it's a notice of motion at the meeting, which means we have to vote on
Okay,
it.
no, I just wanted to check on the timelines because I wasn't sure when they needed approval.
I've talked to our clerk, and we have the development charge meeting on the 26th, and this is a really tight item, so we could throw this into that agenda at that time. Madam Clerk.
If I may, I think the intent would be is that staff would report back in terms of possibilities, in terms of our participation alone, and also how we would fund it, should it go through.
Correct. Thank you. May I have a seconder for this? Deputy Mayor McIntosh, any further discussion? No, all in favor? Of course we're not. Second, thank you. All right, moving on, sorry. Any unfinished business, councillors? I don't believe so. Any new business? I don't believe so. Number 19, this is a bylaw listed below, be read 3 times and passed. A bylaw to confirm the proceedings of tonight's meeting. May I have a motion? Councillor Peters, seconded by Councillor Sherwood. All right, all in favor? A motion to adjourn? Councillor, or Deputy Mayor McIntosh, Councillor Sherwood, all in favor? Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.